Teachers of Reddit, what is the most depressing thing your kids have said? One of my students, who was always in a good mood, came into the class looking very down. She was not acting her usual self. I had to get onto her several times for being on her phone. Again, very unlike her. She asked if she could speak to me in the hallway. Kid, I'm sorry for being in such a bad mood today. Can I tell you why? Me, of course. Kid proceeds to take her cardigan off. She had a tank top on underneath and showed me welts that she had gotten the night before from her mother beating her with an electric cord. She says, "My mother beat me for no reason last night and I don't know what to do." Sadly, it was not the first time I had to report. Edit. I didn't expect this comment to blow up. Lots of questions, but long story short, there was a happy ending. She got to move with her father, much better situation, who lived about an hour and a half away. She was able to finish the school year with us. Her dad would drive her that long distance every morning, and the next school year, she started at her new school. The abuse had been going on for a while. She was an only child. I taught high school freshmen, so she was 14. The day after she told me, she came to my classroom during my conference period and hugged me for a very long time. Thank you everyone for your comments, and to the kind stranger who gave me a silver. I teach pretty much exclusively college freshmen, and by that point they all have that fatalistic sense of humor anyway, but it gets real sad when they get to the end of their rope. Nothing specific that I can remember, but a lot of why did I think I could make it in college? I'm too stupid for this. I should drop out. And they actually mean it. Stuff like that. Monday, however, a student asked to talk to me before class and said, "I know this paper is important and all, and I don't want you to hate me, but I couldn't get my paper done." And I'm used to this sort of thing. I mean, it's just natural. But then he take a deep breath and blurts out, "My dad called me last night and told me he was leaving my mom and moving away, so he's leaving me too, and I just couldn't deal with it. I'm really sorry if you're mad at me." It just hits me hard when they have to deal with more than they should, and on top of that they think I've formed a personal opinion of them and that I'm going to think badly of them based on something like this. I ran holiday science workshops filled with brainy kids, as you'd expect. There was an 11-year-old girl who was brilliant at everything. The content was clearly beneath her. Very quiet, respectful, well liked by the other kids. Her parents were moving soon because she received scholarships to a prestigious school. Whenever her dad came to pick her up, he was obviously proud, telling me about all her achievements, how she was in advanced classes, just won all these sports awards too, etc. Showed videos and photos of her winning all these soccer games. They enrolled her younger brother in similar sessions. He gave it a go in the first few but really struggled, always the last to finish, and felt his work didn't look as good as the others. Looked embarrassed to ask for help. He screamed at his sister when she tried to fix his circuit. Eventually he just began acting out, putting off the work, challenging me to get a laugh out of the other kids, messing around. After a disastrous month he stopped trying altogether. He just came in one afternoon and sat there, not doing anything. I tried to engage him in the activity and said if he didn't like what the other kids are doing, we could pick anything else he wanted to do. He said something like, "What's the point? My parents will never love me as much as they love my sister." Miss Bidet, do you know how to get local electric company to turn your power back on? I get paid today, but they pay me on a card, so do I get out cash and get a money order, and where do I take it to? Kid was 16. But kid got their power turned back on that day, all by themselves. I didn't do spit or biscuits, but teach them how to talk to people in call centers and make the introduction to the CSR. And then later their power bill got reduced because the school social worker has programs for that sort of thing. The local power company sent them some energy saving free stuff, including some light bulbs. Kid and their siblings had been short some lights at home for a while, and we got their water and sewer discounted as well. School social workers are pal. Their surviving parent was trying. It's just hard with a parent of their own who isn't well. That many kids and 2 fast food jobs. Kid is in college now. Damn near full ride. Commutes from home to save money. Puts their housing stipend towards the family rent, utilities, and gas for their own old Toyota. Their parent looks like they just took their first breath in 10 years. I'm proud of all my students, but especially that one. My mother was a teacher for nearly 30 years. She spent the last 10 years at a middle school that was pretty hard up in the Tulsa public school system. She had a very good student who came to school every day in the same clothing. We can call him Jay. The clothing was always washed, but even so, around halfway through the year, his clothing was becoming tattered and stained. The other students began to notice and make comments. The school tried to give him clothing, but he refused. He would not accept a handout. A few teachers came up with a plan for the school, put on a contest where the winner was given some new, very nice school clothing. This contest was set up for Jay to win. This way he could have new clothing and not feel as though he was given anything. Jay won the contest. He accepted the new clothing gladly. The next day he was still wearing his old clothes. My mom asked him why he was not wearing the new clothing. Those are my trophies. I have them hanging on my wall. Rips my heart right out of my chest. My son is 10 and in 4th grade. In Indiana, they have a law called inclusion, which puts special needs kids in regular classrooms. So in other words, there are no special education classes in elementary school. Anyway, my son was born 3 months premature and had 2 severe brain bleeds shortly after birth, causing cerebral palsy and mild retardation. He's a smart kid considering everything, but he's really struggling to read and can't do any of his 4th grade schoolwork. He has an IEP, and basically what he gets is 1 hour a day with a special teacher who teaches him at his own level. 1 hour the rest of the time, he's sitting in a 4th grade classroom with other 4th grade kids who can read, do math, etc. He knows he should be able to do that stuff. It breaks my heart when he says he's stupid and talks about how other kids can read and he can't. His brother is in 2nd grade and brings home straight A's, and I express how I am so proud of both of them, but he doesn't understand. Plus, the school refuses to put him on a different grading system so that he isn't constantly bringing home F's on schoolwork in 1st grade. They had him on a pass/fail grade system, so as long as he tried his best, he would pass. Now they won't, because it's not fair to the other kids. Pisses me off, because it's not fair to my son that he started this life fighting for his life and continues struggling every day. What's it matter to the other kids if he gets a passing grade anyway? I told them he needs some positivity because he gets depressed about it. At 10 years old, he gets depressed because of something he has no control over. Sorry for rambling. Your comment made me think of my son and how sad it is to hear him say that, knowing he's come so far and tries so hard, but he just simply doesn't have the capability. Already made a comment, but I've been thinking about his thread because this is my life every day. Other moments in my career that have touched me. Student of mine drops out to get a job. Happens quite a bit because of the economy where we live. Student in question is couch hopping and trying to support himself and can no longer afford to not work, so I don't see him for 6 months. On his 19th birthday, he had the day off, and you know what he did? He came to school to visit me because he knew I would be happy to see him and he would get at least one happy birthday from someone who cares about him. Anytime a student says anything like, "You're the only one who cares about me. You're the reason I come to school. You're the reason I graduated," etc. kills me every time. Anyone can graduate high school, but they lack the confidence in themselves to see it. I try so hard every day to let them know they can do it, but they go home and get the opposite from their parents. Some days I might be the only positive interaction a student has. I always say good morning when they come in and goodbye when they leave, so they know they are being noticed. I try to always use their names when greeting them, so they know it's specifically for them. I try to remember important dates for them, birthdays/court dates/ if they are going to their driving test that day, and congratulate them personally, or ask how it went. I want them to know they are seen and someone cares. I did a month as a teacher assistant during work experience when I was in 6th form, and normally you stick with the same teacher all day, but a different teacher every day, if that makes sense. Anyway, I requested if for the whole 2 weeks I could stay with the same class, which got accepted, so there I was staying with the year 9B class, ages around 13 to 14, throughout the time. I treated them all as people, not as students, having a joke with them while they got on with their work, etc. About a week in, one student, let's call him Oliver, suggested to the teacher I take out 4 to 5 students to continue work in another room, which was agreed on for every lesson from that point. Every lesson Oliver requested to go out to the other room, but obviously sometimes he couldn't. A further week passes, and I speak to the headmaster about Oliver wanting to constantly go with me, and he suggested to let him go every lesson. He wasn't able to say exactly why. So the next few days Oliver continued to go to the other room along with 3 to 4 other students and got on with work while we all talked about different things during it. On the Friday of the second week, Oliver stayed over as he wanted to ask the teacher if me and him could have a one-on-one session for one lesson to help him catch up. The teacher instantly agreed, but also couldn't say why. So the Tuesday, I invited him into a one-on-one session to help him with his literacy. As we got halfway through the lesson, he looked up and asked me how old I'm. I said I'm 17, which I was at the time. He then asked how long until I'm 18, and I said still a good year to go, which he sighed at. I asked why, and his reply always gets me. I've never had a big brother before, and I live in care. I just wanted you to be my big brother, which was just the saddest thing I've ever heard. He said he has been in care for 10 years, and every time he gets close a case of bad luck happens. It causes him to do bad at school and get terrible results and being constantly moaned out. I was the first person to treat him normally and not as a kid. Since that session he still continued to be a part of the group sessions and getting along with his classmates. As I approached my final day, I knew it would be a tough one. I grew close to the whole class, but I knew Oliver would have a hard time that day, as this has been the first time he has had someone truly properly talk to him. The final lesson approached, and he looked visibly upset. I knew something had to be done, so while a group session happened that day, the last 10 minutes I got Oliver in a room to talk to him. He didn't want me to go, even campaigning for me to get a job there during one assembly the previous week, and he asked if we could stay in contact. I said that would be unlikely as I wasn't close. I just gave him the best advice I could with a promise that if he ever needs someone to talk to, let the school know and they can get something sorted. So after the month was up, I returned to 6th form, and with a couple years of pretty bad luck with no idea what I wanted to do, I got a message off Facebook of him a couple of weeks ago asking if I could come to his results opening. I agreed and we caught up, and when he opened to all as it was, as if my old child just opened their grades, he started to cry and thank me and said words that I keep in my head whenever I feel down. You were the best teacher I had and the best friend I had. Now, he's 18 and I really couldn't be more prouder. The fact that I helped even just a single kid will always help me. Not a teacher, a student, but I was reading through these, and I think 2 of my stories fits here. My memory is a little fuzzy, but yeah. I was in 3rd grade, and my teacher had us write goals on a piece of paper. Everyone else's was I want to get better at, or I want to learn. But mine said I shouldn't be so stupid. Of course, my teacher told me to be kinder to myself and redo it. I didn't understand, because I thought it was obvious that I was stupid, and saying that the truth would be a nice thing. So I kept going back and forth with slightly different rewordings of that. Didn't end up with anything she liked. Another one, 7th or 8th grade, my teacher, bless his goddamn heart, he's a great man, a few weeks after school started, gave us the most important assignment of the year. He handed us a piece of paper and made us write 5 things we love about ourselves. He said if we couldn't finish it, work needed to be done. Everyone was able to finish it rather quickly, even the most emo of us, but I couldn't even think of one. The next day, he apologized for the assignment, crushing a couple of students, myself included. I teach in a local school in Hong Kong. two very close friends. Both are grade 7, but one comes from a very wealthy family. We will call him Richard. The other not. We will call him Greg. Richard always comes to school in a Mercedes driven by a chauffeur, while Greg comes to school by MTR, the public train system, and then walks to school by himself. After school or during weekends, they always go to Richard's house driven by his chauffeur, because obviously he has more space and toys and whatnot. One day, I noticed Richard looking quite sad, so I approached him. He told me he asked his mom if he could take the MTR to school alone and then go to Greg's house by MTR. She immediately said no and told him off for even suggesting taking the MTR when they have a chauffeur. I asked Richard why did he ask that. He said because he wanted to see how Greg's life was like compared to his own, to see how tough Greg has it. I said you could tell your mom the reason, as she might understand why, as she knows Greg's situation as well. In the end, Richard told me he talked to his mom, but she flipped, saying stuff like, "Do you want to be seen as a poor person on the MTR?" Exact opposite of this, something my teacher said that was very depressing, but hopeful in a way. This teacher, we'll call him Mr. Dom, was probably the best teacher I've ever had. He was incredibly funny and worked his ass off to help every kid pass, even the ones that didn't care. I know this because I had severe depression last year and never had the motivation to do better. He always said, just do this one thing. That's all you need to do to pass. And even though I wouldn't do it, he'd still give me more chances. I'd have frequent panic attacks and he'd always come up and ask me if I wanted to talk after class. When I said no, he said, "Okay, just know I'm always here if you need to talk." He never really let on that he was in a bad mood. He just smiled and cracked jokes like he always did, though sometimes I could tell something was off, like when he seemed a bit more tired than usual. Fast forward to spring, and we're talking about To Kill a Mockingbird and finding good things in bad situations. He starts talking about looking on the bright side, and then he says, if my wife hadn't had that miscarriage in October, we wouldn't be having our daughter in September. Granted, he had talked once about this miscarriage before, but this hit so much harder because of the way he was looking at it. He had every right to be depressed and bitter, yet he just talked about how that miscarriage made him able to meet his daughter. He made me realize that, even though I was in a ton of pain right now, it could lead to something good. He had his baby about a week ago, and while I'd really like to go up and say congrats, I don't know if I have a right to, considering how apathetic of a student I was last year. I think two of my most depressing / saddest moments each happened within 24 hours of each other just prior to the 2016 election. Student 1: on election day, a very quiet but wonderfully artistic 5th grade student of mine walked up to me and my co-teacher during a transition with less than an hour left in the school day and gave each of us warm hugs, which was unusual for him and possibly unprecedented. "Goodbye," he told me. "Goodbye? Where are you going, man?" Nonchalant, but completely sincere, he responded, "It's election day. I'm Hispanic, student." To the morning after the election, my co-teacher and I were planning prior to the start of the school day. Classrooms are off limits to students during morning planning. But this day, one of our African American students walked in, cautiously. She was whip smart, the only 5th grader I ever taught who could tell me all about Loretta Lynch, for instance. We looked up, and, trying to gauge where we stood, she softly asked, "You're mad?" Doing our best to remain impartial, I think my co-teacher just said something like, "It was a late night," or something to that effect. The student then approached our work area and her voice changed, suddenly uneasy. With total sincerity, and with fear in her eyes, she asked, "Is he going to send us back to Africa?" We began shaking our heads no, but she continued, breaking into tears as she said, "My mom says, if you believe in God he can't do that." My co-teacher rose out of her seat and embraced her. Our student was sobbing uncontrollably now. It was way too much for me to handle. I'm usually on top of my game around students, keeping it real at all times, and trying to be the one they could rely on to be emotionally in check. But I silently cried into my hands. I just couldn't believe that was the point we were at in America, where something seemingly so insanely outlandish was suddenly something a typically smart 5th grader could consider as potentially realistic. Point not to get on a soapbox, but sometimes I'm not sure everyone considers the impact of rhetoric. Many of us are able to write rhetoric off for what it is, but that's not always true for everyone else, particularly the youth of our country. We were making resumes in my 7th grade tech ed class and discussing community service. Omar asks Mr. the Hog Dog, "What if the judge orders you to community service? Can you list that?" "No, Omar, if you're being ordered to community service you might not need a resume for the jobs you will be able to get." Point. But then it got worse when a girl said, "But everyone goes to jail once." No. She then replied, "Juvie?" Once again, no. I had the kids write a business format letter after every break and tell me what they did over their Thanksgiving/Christmas/winter/spring break to practice writing letters. Then they printed, signed, and swapped with their friends so they could share their break in a fun way. Every time I had to mandatory report a few letters to the counselor, they knew I had to and were looking to tell someone. This provided an outlet. On a happier note, at the end of the year I made every kid write a business format letter, but write to an adult in the school building that helped them, or they learned something from that year, and gave them to the teachers for Teacher Appreciation Week. This was the only thing the school did for TAR Week and the teachers and students loved it. Point. So many tears on the day I handed them out. Okay, I had to bribe some kids to write letters to less popular teachers, and I got a total of 7 in 11 years in that school, and teachers made big scrapbooks of the letters they received. I rarely looked at them, but I saw a few that definitely made the career of the teacher that received it. The kids would once again say things that they would never tell them face to face. One kid thanked the 5th grade teachers for holding him back a year because he felt so much more confident and smarter. The best was a special ed kid who said something like, "I'm sorry I was so mean to you at the start of the year, but I have to get to people before they can get to me. But you are different. You are really on my side and I'm sorry for what I did to you." Next year will be different from the start to the special ed teacher he had that year. The last year I was there, the idiot principal, and I had some serious heat and the teachers knew I was leaving. They all came to me and said, "We know you are mad, but you are going to do the letters one last time, right?" They deserved it, so I did it one last time. I'm not a teacher, but I feel like this story fits here. The class 2 years ahead of mine had it rough. 2 students in that class died. Not that it matters, but these kids were both popular and very well loved by just about everyone, kids and adults, and were very good, well-behaved students/kids people. And their deaths were both kind of freak accidents, or at least uncommon accidents, especially in our small town. One died his 8th grade year, the other in his sophomore year. Only 2 years apart. Point. So there's this teacher in the high school who is extremely popular and well loved by just about everyone, students and staff alike. He's very funny and laid back. Very rarely is he ever completely serious, and even more rarely does he ever really show any real emotion. Despite his outwardly and persistently laid-back attitude, he's kind of calloused against the world, and so never shows his emotions. Since the first boy who died never got to go to high school, this teacher never knew him. But he did know the other boy. That boy was one of his favorite students of all time, and he kind of had a soft spot for him. They were very similar people. He told my class one day about the day that boy had died. At this point it had been 2 years, but when he told us about it, he actually choked up just a little, and he was very solemn and serious the whole time. He didn't give much detail, but he didn't have to. In my school, when a student passes away, teachers must inform the students of their first period class, usually by reading from a paper pre-made for them. And this generally laid back, invincible teacher told us that telling his class about it that next day was one of the hardest things he'd ever had to do. He said that was the only time he'd ever had to leave in the middle of class because of some emotional issue in all his 30+ years teaching. Hearing the seriousness as well as the obvious pain in the voice of this usually fun and very non-serious teacher, and seeing and hearing him choke up about it, all 2 whole years later, broke my heart. When that class graduated, both of those boys still had chairs out for them and their parents, with cap, gown, and the class flower on their parents' chairs. And their names were still called. Both sets of parents were in tears during most of the ceremony. To this day, that's the most bittersweet thing I'd ever seen. I'm going to run away when I'm 16, so I can keep going to school and get into university. I hope I never see any of them again. He was in 4th grade. Them were his family, his parents, older and younger brother. His parents were probably cognitively disabled, or right on the border. They did not function well. His older brother was officially diagnosed as cognitively disabled. His younger brother was diagnosed as autistic, but the school wanted him re-evaluated due to some new behaviors. My student was identified as gifted and talented, was very smart. His parents' plan was to force him to drop out at 16 and get a job and support the 4 of them. That way Dad could stop working. Our counselor had plans in place and was working with the staff at the middle school, 6th grade only, JH, 7th and 8th, and HS to have a safety net in place to make sure this guy got to stay in school and go to university and have the others in the family looked after. One of the advantages of a small town. He stayed in the duty program when he moved from 5th to 6th. That helps because the duty coordinators also communicate and can help in situations like this. I used to teach preschoolers aged 3.5 years old. Our school was very prestigious, upscale, structured, and we followed a popular curriculum for that time. As most teachers know, some kids have big problems, and every school year a teacher experiences, at the very least, one child that is being abused at home in one way or another. One year I had a lovely little girl we'll call Lisa in my class. Lisa was gorgeous, with beautiful, long dark brown curls carefully placed in her hair. Her hair was perfectly tied in the back with French silk ribbons. She was often dressed up in semi-formal frilly, out of style, custom handmade, by her father, baby doll dresses. They were cut just above the knee with lots of ruffles and lace. She looked like a porcelain doll from the last century. When her father dropped her off for school every morning, he would remind her to be very ladylike and to not get her dresses dirty, or he would have to spank her bottom. That struck me as odd, and so did his reaction to my suggestion that she had some appropriate play clothes for when we go to the playground. He said young ladies don't play on dirty playgrounds. Lisa clearly had difficulty adjusting to our structure, was hyperactive, missed her mother terribly, and had no idea what happened to her mommy. She said she woke up one day and her mommy was gone, and she never came back. Lisa thought her mommy didn't love her anymore. Lisa needed a lot of attention, hugs, reassurance, and lots of encouragement. Lisa didn't do well at nap time. She could not go to sleep, ever. I followed the same routine every day, yet Lisa still couldn't sleep. Lisa was so tired. She had deep dark circles under her big blue eyes, but she could not, or would not sleep. To keep herself awake, she often acted out. She would disrupt some of the other kids and keep them awake. I repeatedly explained to her that she didn't have to sleep, but she needed to stay quiet so the other kids could rest. A few weeks into the school year, it seemed like Lisa finally understood the rules about nap time. She was finally laying quietly playing with her stuffed elephant. My relief, a floater, came and I left the classroom to use the restroom and grab my lunch from the kitchen. When I returned, I was horrified. I still am, actually. The person sitting in for me was on her phone playing a game or texting, and Lisa had taken her blanket off, taken her panties off, had her legs spread apart, and was masturbating while some of the other students looked on. Our school had cameras in our classrooms and playgrounds, so parents could log on at any time and see what we were doing. These camera shots were all visible in the front office as well. Everything hit me at once. I was not prepared for this. I quickly put my things down and walked over to Lisa's mat while forcing a relaxed look onto my face. I took her blanket and whispered, "Let's cover you up while you rest, okay?" Just as I covered her up, I noticed severe bruising on her upper inner thighs. I asked her to stay covered up, to hold her elephant for me, and told her I would be right back. My relief saw nothing of what happened. I told her she could go. My regular assistant would be back after nap time. I went back over to Lisa and she immediately asked if she was in trouble. I told her she was not. I didn't want to shame her on top of what she was already obviously going through. I explained to her that she had to keep her panties on while she was in class because her private parts were, well, private and not for anyone else to see. I have never talked about this since the incident. Even thinking about it now makes me sad and sick. When my assistant came back to class, I explained I needed to go to the office and was taking Lisa with me. On the way to the office, I stopped in the middle of the hall and got down on my knees. I asked her how she got all of the bruises on her thighs. She gazed into my eyes, tears welling up, and said that her daddy touches her there when she's sleeping at night. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. Then I asked, what does he touch you with? She replied, his hands and his business. Lisa began to cry, and so did I. She threw her tiny arms around me and begged me not to tell on him. She said if he found out, she told, that she would disappear, just like her mommy did. I wanted to hold her, keep her, protect her at all costs. I was so young and inexperienced, but to be honest, I don't think anything could prepare any teacher for such a thing. I took Lisa back to class, explained to my assistant that I needed to go to the office alone, and I would be back as soon as possible. I knew my assistant was good, and she would keep the class on schedule. I went back to the restroom and tried to compose myself. I attempted to gather my thoughts. I had to do what I thought was best for Lisa, at least what was within my power. I also had to inform the office of what some of the other children witnessed, because as you all know, kids go home and tell everything and anything. I went to the office to speak with the VP, whom we shall call Sharon. It was horribly awkward and emotionally draining. Sharon did not have an open door policy and was known for putting the school before the kids. I was hopeful Sharon would know exactly what to do. She was much older, more experienced, had a PhD in early childhood development, and was in a position of power. I carefully explained in detail what happened with Lisa, what I witnessed, what some of the other children witnessed while the floater was supposed to be watching them, and what Lisa told me in the hall. Sharon's expression never changed. She read a magazine while occasionally looking up at me. She didn't ask any questions. Her tone was flat and disconnected. I sat quietly and stared at her, waiting for a response. After a long bout of silence, she mumbled, "Sounds like Lisa has an active imagination." I was enraged. I told her that I thought it was a very serious situation that absolutely needed to be addressed at once. Then Sharon said she felt I was completely overreacting. I told her that she now had knowledge of a crime being committed against a child, and that child needed someone to care enough to intervene. Failure to report such a crime is a criminal act in itself. She said she wasn't big on accusing paying clients of crimes they probably didn't commit. She told me to get back to my class and do my job. The next day I came to work, and Lisa's things were gone. She was no longer enrolled at our school. Sharon refused to discuss anything regarding Lisa with me. I never saw Lisa again. I still feel guilty. I feel like I failed her. I wonder if she disappeared forever like her mommy did. I wonder if maybe Sharon did call CPS. I doubt it. This will haunt me the rest of my life. Please go easy on me, friends. I have never even spoken about this. I've carried the guilt and sadness with me since the day it happened. My mom was passed out on the floor when I got home. She was slinging crystal and prostituting herself right after she told her 4th grader it was his fault they were being evicted. I'm a school psych in a rural district. I'm an endless well of awful stories from the kids I work with. The above one was spoken with a charming indifference. His only protection is the lack of sense of how horrid his life circumstances truly are. I'm pretty jaded, but that one cut me. I've known and worked with this kid for years. He had struggled out of a pit and last year, he was shoved right back in. I don't know where he is now. I supervised a psych intern last year. First time for me, but I guess I'm getting old. He took over an elementary school I have been at for years. As I went over the students he'd be working with, I was horrified how many times I had to say this kid has been rapped. I think my mind was fortified in such a way that I knew their sad stories individually, never wanting to acknowledge the ugly aggregate. I know that it's fashionable to take a shot at the education system, but we are tasked with educating every kid in the US. In districts like mine, hell, most districts I reckon, that means sifting through our students' existential horrors and still fight to get them reading, writing, and maybe even doing some math. And now, we are expected to make them model citizens and deep thinkers. We're on it, but remember, not every kid walks through those doors ready to learn. Not a teacher, I'm a student. Couple years ago, like 4th 5th grade, wow, you forgot about me. Just like my dad, a teacher sent a kid to sit on the ramp outside because he was misbehaving and forgot she told him to leave. He had been sick for 3 days. She got used to not having him in the class. Different kid. Wow, I don't get why you did this. No one ever does stuff like this for me. Thanks, I always carry the spare hoodie to class. This one girl didn't have a hoodie and it was snowing outside. Rare thing in Texas. So I gave her the thicker one I was wearing and wore the hoodie. I lived down the street from school. Wasn't that much of a walk. I know she lived pretty far away, so she wouldn't freeze to death. She tried to give it back the next day, but I let her keep it. It's 8th grade and I saw her wearing it yesterday. I asked about it and she said it was the only one she had. I can't believe her parents haven't gotten her a faking jacket in 4 years, and it can be 30°F outside sometimes. If you're wondering how something in 4th grade fit her in 8th, she is and always has been a very skinny girl. I have always been chunky and loved oversized shirts, so in 4th grade she was swimming in it. Now it fits her decently. One more damn. I wish my parents loved me as much as all of you guys. A guy said this after he came into class and saw Valentine's cards and candy on his desk. By the way, there was 3 cards and 2 little packets of sugar candy stuff no one liked. I gave him 3 candy bars I got because I felt bad. I wish I could say I liked him, but he was always really quiet, so I didn't know him that well. After that I made sure to hug him when got to school and gave him little treats throughout the year, so he felt loved. I realize now they are probably being abused, and I feel like I should have called someone. I can't now. I don't go to the same school anymore though, and forgot where they live. Not said, but wrote. I was alting in a junior high in a crappy part of Tokyo. The school was okay, but it had a really bad problem with discipline that the teachers just didn't seem to be able to deal with. Kids running around out of class, stopping lessons to argue with the teacher etc. I was only part-time, and at that time I didn't have the chops to help out in that way. Anyway, one time I asked a class to write a short paragraph about their school, and there was one kid sitting at the front who wrote something like, "My school is called X. It is in Tokyo. Some of the kids are very noisy and they cause trouble. But my school is a good school. I wish they would be quiet so we can study." Bear in mind this was much better English than I expected. I said to the teacher, "Wow, did you see what he wrote? He's very serious." She said yes. He's the class president. I dunno. I just felt very sad thinking about that quiet kid just keeping all that frustration in, being stuck in a crappy school. I hope things worked out for him. Would you take an answer from a swimming instructor? I was 16 or 17. A girl and little brother from a single parent home. Had a female friend who was from a 2-parent home. Father was disabled. This will become pertinent, bear with me. I taught the girl swimming lessons, and the 3 spent pretty much all day every day at the local pool. All the kids in town did. There's not much to do in a small town. On a hot summer day, all 3 kids were under the age of 10. One day, the friend and brother were teasing the girl. Other kids brought it to my attention that they were saying bad words. I moved closer and heard things of a wild and disgusting sexual nature. I immediately put a stop to it, hauled all 3 to the pool office. I spoke to the friend and brother separately and asked where they heard and learned of these things. They said the girl told them about some things an older male relative made her do with / to him. I thanked them for being honest. I told them to never tease her about it again. I told them the only people they could tell this to had to say that I sent them, and gave the kids a code word that the good adults would use. I then talked to the girl. She cried and detailed her sexual abuse in horrific detail. I told her I would get her help as soon as I could, but asked her to try and never be alone with her abuser, and if it couldn't be avoided, to call the police. I also gave her a code word and to only talk about it with an adult who had that word. I went straight home and asked to speak to my mom in private. She was a nurse and had professional ties to social work and would know better how to get help than my dad. She called a social worker friend and the local RCMP. The next few days was a blur of interviews, statements, and follow-up. Here's what I learned. Girl had tried to tell her grandmother, was told nice girls don't talk like that. Girl tried to tell her mom. Mom thought she learned it from her friend, more on this in a bit, and told her not to watch movies at her friend's house anymore. Girl ran out of options, told her friend and brother, who, because of the movies they had seen at friend's house, thought it was funny and teased her. This is where the story began. Friend's dad is disabled, unable to take care of his wife's sexual needs. Wife has a boyfriend. Husband initially agreed, then changed his mind. Wife doesn't care. Wife and boyfriend routinely watch Born to get in the mood. Leave it running. Friend watches, shows girl and brother. Abuser, only 15. About the same time I'm giving a statement to our CMP. Tells his mom he's been doing something wrong and can't stop. Girl and brother get to stay at home. Start counseling. Friend temporarily placed in foster care while mom and boyfriend take parenting classes and learn about what is and isn't appropriate. WRT human sexuality and children's exposure to same. Abuser, due to his awareness of wrongdoing and self-reporting, avoids charges, is immediately placed into intensive counseling. All things considered, it sort of worked out. I'm no longer a teacher, but I taught at this small school for 12 years in Australia. So I had this one kid in my class that I really liked. He was always enthusiastic and bright. However, one day he came to school and he was really sad and tired. I just ignored it and thought he might have had a late night. However, this continued for the next few days before I did anything. I asked what was wrong, and at the first he just said he was tired. However, I kept persisting, and eventually he told me that he mum and dad had broken up and that his mum has a new boyfriend. He kept going and told me that the boyfriend was really mean to him and quite often would hurt him with a belt or just punch and kick him. I asked the boy if the boyfriend did anything else, and he told me that the boyfriend had sexually abused him and that it really hurt. This was all one lunchtime, he told me, and so I told him that he could stay at my place with his siblings. At first he hesitated, but eventually he accepted, and that night they came over. The kids stayed at my house for a few more nights until one day at lunchtime they got pulled out by someone that I didn't know. I didn't see them for the next 2 days, but I was getting worried, and then the next day, just before I alerted police, they came back. I once again sat down with him at lunch and asked why he skipped school. He immediately broke down and started crying. He told me that his mum's boyfriend and his mum had a fight. He told me that they spilt and that my mum has a death threat from the ex-boyfriend. The boy told me that his mum just disregarded it. However, 2 days later he came back and had killed her. They had been pulled out by their original dad and they went to the mother's funeral. The dad has asked them who they were with for the previous days, and they told him they were with me. So I told the kid that him and his siblings could stay with me again until they had somewhere else. A few days later, out of nowhere, the dad rang me and asked if I would be able to keep the kids for a bit longer. So I said yes. However, he didn't ring back for another month or so. In this time I had to tell the school that I was their caretaker. I was given extra funding and decided that I would register to adopt them. I applied and was granted permission. When the dad rang back I told him the news, and he agreed, thankfully. Ever since I have had the children in my care and they have grown up to be my kids. They are now aged: George, 16, Sophie, 14, and Sarah, 13. Their dad still hangs around and comes over every week or so for a dinner, and as the kids are all very bright and outstanding, I got them all scholarships to a high school at the large school in the nearby cities. I'm just so thankful that nothing ever happened to them. How about the other way around? When I was in either 8th or 9th grade, my choir director, normally a pretty boisterous and somewhat abrasive man, came in and sat on his piano bench quiet. Being a group of younger teenaged boys, we didn't take much notice due to being engrossed in conversation or whatever else we were doing. The director started the class off by talking to us, which was absolutely different than what he normally did, which was vocal warm-ups. He started talking about depression and suicide, and how a couple years back a kid in his class had committed suicide, and for a long time they found it hard to fill his spot on the risers or even really bring him up. It crushed our director, of course, and as he told the story his voice noticeably pitched up, and he was clearly upset. He finished by telling us that if we were ever in that situation where we thought about suicide, that we should just come find him instead, and he'd do whatever he could to make sure we were in a better situation by the end of the day. I think he might have shed a tear or two when he finished with "just tell somebody." I never learned who the person he mentioned was, but I figured out after that he had mentioned it because another kid 2 years up from my year had killed himself that weekend. Even thought he didn't know the second one in the slightest. He found it important enough to tell us about it. At the time I was dealing with my own emotional struggles, and that speech that had lasted maybe 5 minutes kept me up for hours that night. To avoid glorifying mental illness or suicidal ideation, I'll just say that I got hit hard by how affected he was by the loss of his student, which later partially led to me seeking professional help. I don't think I'll ever really forget that in all the time I've known the guy, that was the only time he had even really bared himself emotionally, and in such a dramatic fashion. It was great to know he really cared, though, even if he never let on. 2 things, not a teacher, but as a college student. I had a business ethics professor who noticed I was off, and then late the next time, he pulls me aside and asked me if I was okay and if I needed anything. He said he noticed I wear dog tags and asked what they meant to me. My boyfriend, now fiance, had them specially made for me when we got together, and I never took them off. He was starting deployment training that month. The next professor was my all-time favorite ever. Criminal justice is what I got my degree in, and I took as many of his classes as I could. He was the most helpful when it came to anything and everything. I moved out of state and got an email from the counselor saying I still needed 3 credits to graduate. I thought I was done. And I called him crying, saying I needed any online class I could because I was 5 hours away and I must have calculated my credit wrong, and I was so stressed out. He said don't worry about it. Give me 2 hours. He calls me back and says manually register for class X and you will be added. I already spoke with the professor, and he is good with it, by the way. I chose the class I thought would be easiest for you and low stress. See you at graduation. And I got to thank him in person wearing my cap and gown, and we both about cried. I was teaching one of those easy generalized history classes for college freshmen. We had some tests coming up. I made them super easy because it takes on average 5 minutes to grade each blue book for 130 students, and no one wants to bother with that in an intro class. It was a super generalized class for kids who just don't care about history. Okay, so this went well for a few years. Everyone got an A on this test because all they had to do was show up and write down simple or moderate short answers about really simple things they had talked about in class. There was a lot of reading, but I don't test the intros on readings because I know they don't read them for the test. In class participation, I get this blue book from a girl whose name I'd never seen before. Checked the roster, she's in the class, but she's never shown up. She hard failed that test, but then in the back of the book drew pictures. She wrote only a few lines for each test question, but then wrote a novel about how she was going to kill herself and how her life was over before it began. She drew pictures of her committing suicide in about 10 ways. Blue books are like 20 pages long. She had like 3 pages of test and 10 pages of suicide note. I found her info and contacted her to come in and talk about the test and how we can get her a better grade, but that went right to the top before I even looked her up. As far as I know, Student Medical Services took care of it. She was back in class twice and disappeared. I don't remember the grade she got or if she withdrew. It's 8 years later, and I still feel horrible about how she was feeling and how little we are allowed to help. It's hard to see a kid struggle like this and list that she's failing out of school and disappointing everyone as the main reason, when in fact there was virtually no failing my class if you just show up, and she was in her 2nd semester altogether. Not a teacher, but rather a bus driver. To give a little background, usually I only drive the intercity coaches, but on this occasion one of the regular school bus drivers called in sick, and I just happened to be in the yard returning one of the coaches when he called, so I covered. This particular route covered 3 schools, 1 public primary school, 1 private primary school, and 1 public high school, and so it went all over the place, doubling up stops, and is quite confusing. To me anyway. So the first stop is the public primary school for after school pickup. Little kids are usually crazy loud and hard to manage, but for some reason, possibly because they recognized me as the bus driver with the seat belts and cameras, that doesn't put up with shit on excursions, they were extremely quiet and unexpectedly well behaved. Great for me as the route was very confusing for me, and I had to pay close attention, so I didn't miss any stops, and that I made the right turns. Anyway, one little girl, maybe 5 or 6, jumps on and sits right up the front and starts talking my ear off. It was the Friday before Father's Day and the teacher had obviously arranged a few arts and crafts for the kids to do for Father's Day. I couldn't talk to her most of the time and she recognized that, so she'd hit me up at each stop with a new question or statement. Stop 1 shows me a beer coaster she painted from a stencil. This is me, and this is Daddy. But Daddy doesn't really look like that. He can't stand. He's in a wheelchair. Stop 2. Daddy wasn't always in a wheelchair. He hurt his head, and so now he needs a wheelchair. Stop 3. But Mummy isn't home much anymore and nobody can help Daddy get in his wheelchair, so he just stays in bed all day until Mummy gets home from work. Stop 4. Mum is going to send us pizza for dinner because she has to work late tonight. Stop 5. This is my house here with the white fence and the green roof. Now usually we aren't allowed to let the little ones off the bus unless a parent is there to collect them, but seeing as her house was right at the bus stop, and since it sounded like having to pick her up from the bus depot would have really made Mum's day, I made an exception and just stood the bus at the stop until she made it through the front door. The next Monday I asked the regular driver what the story was with the little girl. He told me her father had a stroke a month ago while driving home from work. He crashed into the corner store, and on top of having to recover from a stroke he was busted up from the accident and had a broken leg, arm, and shoulder. To add insult to injury, he didn't have insurance, so the family no longer has a car, is on the hook for damage to the corner store, and Mum now has to work 3 casual jobs just to keep food on the table. I didn't know whether to be proud of her resilience or depressed that she perhaps didn't realize the long hard road ahead for all of them. As part of a government program, Your Tax Dollars at Work, I taught at an inner city magnet school that had a partnership with a local university. If you passed certain requirements, including a big test at the end of middle school, you'd get guaranteed admission and tuition at a good school. One girl had been failed by the system. In the 8th grade, she had 2nd grade math skills. I did extra hours and tutored her every day for the whole year. To her credit, she tried and fought every step of the way. At the end, she was at a 7th grade math level. In the 8th grade though, she was still a year behind. I tried to get the admins to see her progress and potential, but she missed the cutoff and couldn't be admitted to the next level of the program. She didn't cry, just thanked me for trying so hard with her, and the school year ended. On the final day of class she said, "Thanks, Mr. McKinglemonade. It was really nice of you to try to help me. No one ever did that for me before. I'm sorry I let you down." I said all the things you want about her doing her best and to keep trying hard. My program finished, and I never found out what happened to her as I wasn't allowed to keep in touch with a bunch of kids. I think about her often, and how some people just need someone to try for them. Context: I'm 16 in a few months and still in high school. So this is actually something I said as a kid. I would brag about how disciplined I was because my parents beat me whenever I did something wrong. I also openly told my teachers that I didn't get work done because I was too busy trying to stop my parents from fighting. I was constantly covered in bruises and grazes. I didn't realize that this was abnormal, so I spoke of it like I was talking about what I had for dinner the previous night. Here's the best part. No one called CPS. CPS still hasn't stepped in. I'm still living with my parents. Even if they've stopped abusing me, I'm struggling with severe PTSD that stops me from doing basically everything. I've been left crippled with the aftermath. I know it's not the happy ending that a lot of the other comments have, but the reality is that sometimes no one comes to the rescue. But that doesn't mean I can't save myself. I have gotten myself a part-time job as a piano tutor. I have managed to start getting therapy with the aid of others, and I have even been able to place myself at the top of the food chain in my family. While I may not have power in legal terms, when it comes to making decisions for myself, I have made it clear that my parents have no say in the matter. I now have more power and status than them in arguments. With that said, there is still a long way for me to go in terms of mental health and legal conditions, custody over myself, moving out, etc. It's not a happy ending yet, but it's a promising start. Not a teacher, but I coach soccer. I have a team of 6 and 7-year-old boys, and in this league the coach acts as the referee and can kind of follow the kids around and help them from the field instead of yelling from the sidelines and whatnot. So this little boy, we can call him Jay, has, ever since the beginning of the season, been a pusher. Now, you can push in soccer, but you can't put your arms out in front of you or like a chicken wing and push. This is what the kid is doing. I call him a chicken all the time, which makes him laugh, but one time, I called him for the foul after a particularly rough game for other reasons, and mostly rough for me, and not so much the kids, and he kinda puts his head down and says, "Oh, what's the point? I'm no good at anything." Keep in mind this kid is 6 or 7, he's a baby. I talked to him at the end of the quarter, because they're little, so they get to play 4 quarters instead of 2 halves. So they don't get as tired, and he seemed okay, just frustrated, but it hurt, because I've been there, and to see one of my kids this upset, it hurt me. I was the student telling the teacher, if that counts. I was in 7th grade struggling to accept the fact that I was trans, FTM, which lead to extreme depression, anxiety, and the likes on top of normal puberty point. In my English class we had to write one page with the prompt, how do you see yourself in 5 years, and what have you dreamed of doing by then, or something along those lines. I asked my teacher if I could do a different prompt or assignment. She told me no, so I told her I wasn't going to do it. She proceeded to call me lazy among other things. So I basically wrote about how I did not plan on being alive in 5 years, so I never thought that far in the future. I also wrote how I pretty much wanted to kill myself every night, and that would lead to me crying myself to sleep, which in turn caused me to think that I was pathetic and worthless, kinda faked up, and I feel bad that I didn't just bullshit the assignment, but I got a 100%, and she left a note saying I could talk to her if I needed, which made me so unbelievably angry at the time. This isn't so much a depressing revelation, but a shocking one. I taught college, and had a student email me the night before an exam telling me a family member passed away that night. She said she wasn't emotionally stable enough to take the exam. So I just asked her to bring me, or link me, an obituary or announcement from the funeral home or something. No big deal. She was going to miss a good amount of time as the family lived more than a 10-hour drive away. I get an email from her about a week later saying she still wouldn't be in class that week either because of her family member passing. She further explained how she was emailing my other homework assignments so she didn't get behind and would take the exam when she got back. Everything was more than I'd expect the normal student to do. Then she added that she'd send me a link so I'd better understand why she was going to be out for such an extended period of time. After reading the link, original link is dead, but this is the same story. I was shocked. Not only by the story, but by how thoroughly and well she had been handling her schoolwork given the situation. When she returned to school, I had a conversation with her about her missed work and offered to just exempt her from the exam given the situation. Her response was something to the effect of, "Thank you, but I want to take the exam. He has already changed so much in my life, and I'm not going to let him change anything else." Rarely have I ever been more impressed with the strength of one of my students. I teach at-risk students at a Title I school, so I have stories upon stories upon stories. Family members murdered, kids having suicidal ideations, breakdowns, kids being kicked out, abusive situations, etc., etc. But there is one story that has stuck with me because it really showed how limited we are in our ability to intervene. I had a student a few years back who had just turned 20. Her abusive mother had pulled her out of school at 15 to hide the abuse and kept her mostly isolated from the world. She finally emancipated herself at 17 and moved in with her boyfriend of only a month and became mostly financially dependent on him. She then held a job for a little bit before returning to high school on her own at 18, almost 19, to finish her diploma. Unfortunately, she pretty much went from one abusive situation to another. She came to me about 3 months before graduation and showed me a long series of disturbing texts from her boyfriend emotionally coercing her to get an abortion and ask me to help her escape. She had already gone to the police, who said there was no signs of physical alterations and not much they could do except write a report in case anything came up in the future. Now, the big problem was, she was 20 and legally an adult. There's not a whole lot the school can do, especially since the police were already involved. The adult shelters in my area are known for their horrific conditions, staff abuse and sexual assaults. We only have church-run ones that use shaming and literal 24/7 Jesus music on loop to try to reform people. I wasn't going to send her there. We met with guidance and put our heads together, but we were really at a loss in the end. It took about a month of counseling, but she arranged to move in with a family friend and did finish her diploma. She came back to visit a few years ago and was proud to say she had been promoted to manager. I wasn't a teacher, but I worked with young men put into juvenile placement. Essentially, I was tasked with supervising them during various activities and enforcing the rules, breaking up fights, chasing absconders, etc. 99.9% of the time, it was a laid-back gig. We were never supposed to chat with the kids about why they were there for a variety of reasons, but we were also encouraged to form appropriate relationships and serve as mentors for the kids. We had this one kid who was in placement for plotting a school shooting. He got caught long before he had a chance to make it a reality, and he got sentenced to placement until he graduated. He definitely didn't look the part of a school shooter, but his reputation made sure nobody messed with him. One night in the student union, the kid and I were chatting about idle stuff as his peers went about their business. The next thing I knew, the kid was unloading everything, why he did what he did, how he did it, how much he missed his family, etc. The kid's upbringing was horrid, and bullying at school finally pushed him to the breaking point. I felt conflicted, because I really wasn't supposed to discuss those things, but I wouldn't have felt right telling him to stop. After he vented for about 30 minutes, I asked him what he learned and what he hoped to accomplish. Kid, I just want to be a better person and see my family again. I wanted nothing more than for that kid to succeed, get the help he needs, and be a productive man in the world. Not a teacher, but I volunteered to help at my son's elementary school Olympic Games, an event where all the different grades compete against different classes of the same grade. This one poor boy was the most uncoordinated little bugger I've ever seen, but man, did he try his little heart out. I mean, we are talking about a kid who tripped over his own feet 3 times during the race, but picked himself up each time and kept going. All of the other kids in his class kept cheering him on, even though he was about 30 seconds behind the next closest person in a race, meant to take about 2 minutes. Some of the other volunteers and I decided to give this kid one of the medals anyways. I know adults who would have slunk away after the second time, but he kept going. So, when we are handing out medals, one of the volunteers announces that for dedication and perseverance, this kid was getting a medal as well. The kid who'd been so buzzed congratulating the winners, it took him a minute to realize we'd called his name, takes his medal and runs over to his folks, beaming, showing off his medal. I don't know what was said, I was too far away to hear, but I saw the anger in his dad's face, and a few minutes later, the kid came walking back over, head hanging, and announced loudly, sounding like he was crying, that he didn't deserve a medal because he'd done so bad and come in last. The volunteers and his classmates all started telling him he did deserve it, that he'd done well. In a rush or panic, the boy shoved the medal at a volunteer, babbling about how he didn't deserve it, he'd been clumsy and unawful. Finally, the volunteer, not knowing what else to do, awkwardly took the medal back. I look over at the kid's parents. The mom looks about in tears, but his freaking dad is just nodding in satisfaction, a smirk on his face. Not a teacher, but a student. I started having depression in middle school. My grades dropped, I was losing sleep, etc. Teachers noticed but would often just tell me I need to try harder, etc. Until in sophomore year, my physics teacher pulled me aside and asked me to come in at lunch. He was really nice about it. At lunch, He didn't ask me to do any work or anything. He just ate lunch with me and had conversations like he would with a friend. Afterwards he asked if there was anything he could do to help me with my work. He said it wasn't my fault if I was failing my classes. It was the teacher's job to help me pass. I told him I was just struggling a bit with motivation. We ended up having a really deep conversation. He didn't have a class after lunch and he excused me from my class so we could continue, and eventually I confided in him that I was depressed and suicidal and even showed him the cuts on my arms. He told me that it wasn't my fault, that the system was failing me. He talked about what options I had to help me get better and all the resources I have. Eventually me and him came to the conclusion that I should be hospitalized. He was so nice about it. And honestly, he saved my life. I think he knew about my cuts before I told him and had probably assumed correctly about the depression, etc. And that's why he kept talking to me instead of sending me to my next class. Not what a student said, but what he wrote. A 9th grader named Xavier, my first year of teaching, kept writing the same story for every prompt. This was the gist of it. Xavier walked in the rain, excited to be home with his father, who had recently gotten out of jail. One of Xavier's girlfriends, just friends, accused his dad of molesting her, so he had spent some time away. Xavier didn't know if it was true. The worst part about it was that Xavier had convinced his dad to let her stay with them after she got kicked out of her own home for causing trouble. Xavier doubted her accusations, even when the conviction went through. Something about the way he described it made me think his father was innocent, but that hardly mattered. There's actual truth and emotional truth. Whatever the former was, Xavier's emotional truth proclaimed his father as saintly. He stepped up to raise Xavier alone after his mom ran off. Anyways, his father had only been home a few days at this point, so the kid was excited to spend time with him, hence walking home in the rain instead of waiting for a ride. As he rounded the corner to his home, he noticed his garage door was open. Weird. A strange shadow stretched across the driveway too. He got closer. He saw his father hanging from the garage door frame. Turns out the personal disaster of being labeled a child molester was too much for him. For a few weeks, I spent as much time as I could helping him get his story right. I spent several lunch breaks crying in my car that month. So the elementary school does a once-a-year trip for the seniors before they go to high school, involving a trip to the woods and cabins, all that jazz. Sleepover for the weekend, etc. As you'd imagine, it's the most important trip for all of them. Saying goodbye to kids going to different schools that have grew up together for 8 years. Although, each student had to pay a pretty steep price of a few $100s and to have some spending money. Naturally there was about 3 out of 30 kids that didn't sign the sheets, but when the sheets were handed in, those 3 were all crying. Their parents couldn't afford it, and this trip is like a rite of passage for these kids. I didn't go on the trip, I stayed back to teach the 3 kids that didn't go. They all came for the week, every day with shitty lunches with silence pasted over their entire demeanor. At the end of the week I got pizza for us and tried to play games with them, but just blank stares. Weren't interested in the pizza either. One kid threw his sandwich away one bite in almost daily, and I asked him why, and he said my mom still doesn't know I hate said sandwich. I tried putting on movies and they all just put their heads down. I hope to God the depression doesn't carry through high school. We've all been there. It's a slippery slope. It was my last day seeing them after all. I am not a teacher, but was an intern for a week at a daycare for elementary school children. I worked for a week and came back after a longer break. One of the girls I was looking after, she was 2nd or 3rd grade, ran up to me, greeting me happily. When I first started working there, I noticed she didn't have a lot of friends and I saw her parents, who looked a little rough. That day she ran up to me and excitedly showed me her shoes, which were black flat shoes with a golden snake glued to the front. You could see it. It was more on the cheaper side. Someone had just stuck plastic, gold sprayed snaked onto the front of some black satin flats. She was really excited though, and told me, Alara, look at my shoes. We went to Egypt during the school break and my parents got me these for €10. 10. The other children laugh at them though, because they say they backwardly ugly. I felt so bad, because €110 really ain't a lot for shoes, and you could see it's just like those cheap tourist goodies too. Why make a girl feel bad about something she backquotes excited about? I had a similar thing happen to me with my old bike, which was special, because it was pink with dinosaurs. People made fun of it, and I never drove it again. So I just turned to her and told her just ignore them. The shoes look really cool. Like those golden snakes. Wow. She seemed really happy. I wish I knew how she was doing these days. I'm not a teacher, but when I was in high school, I was having a hard time. I had been abused by my twin brother, and he was finally going to jail, but my mother refused to let me talk about it with anyone. Well, I was a smart kid, liked English, so I was in creative writing classes. One day, I just stayed put during lunch, because that day was the day the abuse had started. I was barely keeping it together. My teacher, God bless her, just started talking to me. We just talked. But for a moment, I felt a little better. I started to cry a little, because it just felt so awful to have someone show interest in how I was feeling, and she wasn't even related to me. She kept an eye on me after that, made herself available when she really didn't have to. I love that woman, and it's really only because of her that I considered trying for a college far away from home. I miss her dearly, every day. So, Mrs. Wilder, if you ever come across this, thanks for talking with me and making me feel like I matter. Please, 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 don't be this teacher student not teacher, but when I was 9 in 4th grade my grandfather passed away from carbon monoxide poisoning, and it hit me hard, like I knew about death before, but the reality just sunk in. I wouldn't say that I was depressed, just constantly sad for a while, probably for the rest of that school year, and I remember during free time I sat in a corner and decided to write a will. My grandma and mom were talking about it before I went to school. One of the kids in class saw what I was doing, and I told them to go away. Kept pressing on about it, and I told them I'm not doing anything bad, just writing this in case anything happens. Apparently she told the teacher, who took me inside during recess and had the piece of paper in her hand. She didn't really handle the situation well at all. Looking back on it 10 years later, she basically told me to stop writing things like this that are scaring the other kids, because I was too young to need a will and to just cry it out like other people. She'd stung. She then told me that I would have to write on a paper 10 times each lunch for the following week. I'm sorry for scaring my classmates, and was forced to eat lunch inside. Never told my mom about this, thinking at first the teacher would let her know. Nope, never happened. I think this is around the time I first ever had the thought of just not being alive, not killing myself. That comes later, more just going in my sleep. Not me, but my mom, who's an education assistant. She can be strict, but will always go the extra mile to help students. Some examples that stand out are the 12-year-old who chose to separate himself from his family. He independently took the bus to the Family Justice Center and presented his case about how his parents were never there to take care of him, feed him, clothe him, or pay water and electricity bills. I remember that before that occurred, he proudly showed my mom a large watch his dad gave him. It used to be an expensive fancy watch that the grandfather had given to the father when he graduated high school, but it got busted and cracked, so the dad gave it to the son. With the kid's permission, my mom actually paid to have it partially restored and fitted, so long as the kid understood that he could not show it to his dad, because they knew the dad would just take it and sell it for drug money. 2 refugee brothers from Central America came to her school, and she worked with the eldest one. He had big behavior problems, mostly from PTSD, because he had witnessed a lot of death, including his parents. Both kids happened to be fostered by the youth care worker that works in the school. At the end of the school year, this guy got busted for possessing and making child pornography, including having incriminating photos of these kids. Sad. Not a teacher, but my wife is. She had a kid whose mum was a total mess. She'd clean herself up for just long enough for the social workers to step back, then blow straight back into drugs the moment she'd got some breathing room. 3 things he said to her which nearly broke me. It's okay, I know not to touch the needles, thanks mum, after she'd just given breakfast, because he hadn't eaten for 3 days. I don't want to get it dirty. When she found him changing out of the school uniform she'd brought him back into the hole-filled tracksuit bottoms he normally wore ready to go to lunch point. That kid deserved so much better. Another of her kids developed some fairly stinking anger management issues after social stepped in and took him, his brother and two sisters into care. They couldn't place them all together, so he and his brother went to one foster family and his sisters went elsewhere. During one of his many meltdowns my wife asked him why he was so angry. Because it's my fault we are not together. He was the one who called social. Because of his parents' abusive behavior. He blamed himself because his parents were unfit to raise children. That one made me so angry I would happily have gone to prison having put those dicks 6 feet under. I was the student, not the teacher. Back in high school, junior year American history, I was having a lot of trouble completing assignments and paying attention in class. That teacher noticed, and I had to come clean. Point: the water was turned off occasionally. DCF was investigating my house for child and domestic abuse, which my guidance counselor called in, but DCF determined we weren't priority, since there were no broken bones yet and my siblings, all younger than me, were too scared to back me up. On top of an abusive family I had an abusive boyfriend. I also had several friends decide to dump me, because I wasn't cool enough to drink and smoke with them. So I had to explain I was a little too busy with fighting DCF, surviving my parents, getting water to my younger siblings. Youngest was around 2 or 3 years old, coping with a boyfriend I wasn't ready to leave yet, being ostracized, and dealing with self-harm, bulimia, and suicide attempted. Point: that teacher got really quiet, and the next day gave me some water to take home. She didn't bother me about my excessive note-taking in class anymore. I wasn't taking notes, I was journaling, because that's all I could do to keep myself in one piece. I had a little extra time to do assignments. I got it all done, and I passed the class. The next year I was still in the thick of it, but I saw her around the school and we would talk occasionally. Point: I also want to mention my art teacher the following year who let me hide in the supply closet and sometimes work back there, because sometimes I was too overwhelmed to be surrounded by 30+ other noisy students. And when the garage door slammed down on my head and my parents didn't care, this art teacher got the sports medicine teacher to check one out concussion. The school guidance counselor and school psychologists tried their best to help me just get through the last year of high school too. Just one more year until I turn 18 and can leave. I didn't exactly get to leave home at 18, but I was no longer being physically abused, because my father knew damn well that this time, since I was a legal adult, the police had to start taking me seriously. And then I got kicked out at 19. I'm glad I was, or I wouldn't have met the support system I have now. Point: and I'm due to give birth in just 2 weeks. My family is trying to guilt me into letting them see the newborn. Not even asking nicely. Oh, I can't wait to see my beautiful granddaughter. Just I'm going to be very angry if I find out you're letting your mother-in-law be at the hospital and not me. You'll probably drown or starve that kid in a couple weeks anyway. Beach: no, I raised your youngest 2 kids, and they honestly prefer being with me. The little one literally asked my husband to adopt him and be his new parents. He cries so much when it's time to take him home, and he's only 6. The poor kid doesn't know why they won't let him have any fruit. Faking fruit. He always asks me for fruit now, so I make sure to have plenty of fresh fruit for him: cherries, pears, raspberries, dragon fruit, mango, peaches, melon, blueberries, plums. He always makes such a funny face when he's tasting new fruits. It's like the face a kid makes when he's tasting something super strange and confusing, and you think he won't want any more of it, but then he just keep eating it with such an intense look, like he's trying to solve some complicated math problem. So freaking weird, so freaking adorable. I'm crying now because I miss him so damn much. My dad taught in a public rural school for 2 years straight out of college, and also was the school counselor. He told me he had a student who came to talk to him about her dad rapping her. According to the girl, her parents considered it the dad's responsibility to teach her how to have sex. Obviously my dad was pretty fucking horrified by this, called CPS, and refused to teach ever again. On my side, I come from a long line of teachers lol. My students are mostly quite privileged, but I hear some awful things from the parents. One of my favorite students last year was not super gifted in terms of academia, but was so sweet and thoughtful and funny. I broke my arm and all the other kids loved to punch and pull the cast to see if it would hurt. They're 5, but this girl came right up to me, kissed the cast in my face a bunch of times, and kept saying, "Ms. Hamburger, does it hurt? Are you okay? I feel so sad for you." Imagine my displeasure when I had to sit through parent-teacher meetings where her mom would go on and on about how the girl wasn't smart at all, couldn't learn this, wasn't even cute, etc. The student definitely knew what her mom thought of her. All I could do was try to repair some of the damage done. I just hope her teachers continue to love and appreciate her. I'm a teacher in a private after-school ESL institute for kids of all ages. There's this boy, 11 now, that I've known for a few years. A genius? No. A smart boy? Definitely. He does good work in class, shows steady and regular progress, and definitely outlevel not only all of his classmates, but also the vast majority of his grade as a whole, without having ever been into a native English environment, which speaks volumes. One day we were doing math, the point being learning math vocabulary in English. The math level was fairly low, something any kid his age can do without aid. We're talking basic operations here. But he was stuck in front of his textbook, not even trying, which didn't look like the boy I knew. Point I go to him and ask him, "Why aren't you doing anything? It's not difficult, is it?" "I can't do that." "What do you mean you can't? Is it hard?" Switching to his native language, "Because my brain is garbage." "What? Who told you that?" "My teacher did." Point send me back straight to school. Trying my best myself, I forgot how some teachers are real pieces of trash and abusive. Not me, but my psych teacher. He talks a lot about different school stories to relate to us ideas. This one was about behaviorism versus cognitive psychology. We go to a fantastic public school. It's in a dubious part of town. Multiple for-real shooters nearby every year, but it's different from other public schools, since you have to test in. He taught at another public school when he started teaching, I wanna say 30 or more years ago, also in a bad part of town, different part of town. Infamous school for being a bit of trouble. Point he mentions backpacks. He says you all would probably say back quote, "Well look here Mr. S, I need to carry my things around all day and I need a bag to do it." So you'd probably say that you were being cognitive about this. Nodding heads. Well, at infamous school, I had a psych class. First year of teaching. First day not a single student brought a book bag. Second day, same thing. This went on for about a week before I pulled one of the kids outside and said back quote, "Kid, what the heck is going on here? I can't teach you guys unless you take notes, but you don't have any bags or books or binders." The kid looks up at him and explains. After they get off the bus it's still a 1/4-1/2 me walk to their house. If they have a bag they'll get mugged because people will think it has something valuable in it and they'll lose their school books. Each is, and I kid you not, over $50 to replace, so none of the kids risk taking bags anymore because it's not worth getting beat up. So the logic for them is the environment they're in prevents them from bringing backpacks to school and is there for behaviorism, except for the kid's story. That's a near direct quote. Later Mr. S told us he bought a shelf and binders for the kids in his class. Imagine being a fresh out of college teacher and being told that by your first batch of students. This teacher especially has so caring that I could just see his face twist when he told the story. So if I had to guess his story for this post, it'd be that. Man, will I not forget the difference between behaviorism and cognitive science. One of my kids in my nurture group class, aged 11. Why do the other kids get to have different teachers for their subjects and we have to have the same one? Is it because we are not well behaved enough to be allowed to do grown-up subjects? He was in an intensive 10 hours a week literacy skills class because they literally couldn't read, but he didn't understand that everyone else wasn't like that as well. He thought his level of literacy was just normal. Also from that class a kid asked me if he could please not swap his fun Christmas quiz to be marked by someone else because nobody could ever read his handwriting, and it made him sad to feel stupid when someone else saw he got everything wrong. Another once apologized for only bringing in half a packet of biscuits for our celebration form breakfast because mum doesn't let me have money to get food. I had obviously already brought enough food for everyone, but they also desperately wanted to contribute as well because they felt bad for me having to get everything for them. They were 11, man. Kids shouldn't have to feel bad about that point. I really miss those kids. They were a really special group and I loved seeing them every morning. When I left they all signed a photo of us together as a class for my leaving present, and they all clubbed together to get me my favorite chocolates. I cried a lot when I left them. Not a teacher, but son of a teacher, so my stepmom recently started teaching pre-K at a school nearby. It's near a military base, so it's primarily military families, but also kind of a city school, so there's a lot of kids from less than savory homes. Anyways, I was asking my mom about how her second year as a teacher was going, and she sighed and looked at me completely drained. She unloaded. The school year just started, and my mom was nearly in tears about these things. These two blonde twins in her class are from a less than savory home, and they're awful. They're constantly swearing, will outright attack my mom, they aren't potty trained, and they're never clean. Turn out these two little girls are the kids of a drug dealer in the city. They've called my mother a hoe to her face numerous times. A boy from a foster home, when they were introducing themselves, said he lived with Massey and David, and my mom asked why he called his parents by their names, and he said Massey and David aren't my parents. This was how my mom learned he was in foster care. Pointer kids from my mom's first year as a teacher, now in kindergarten, comes to my mom's room every single morning. He doesn't have a good home life. He lives with his dad, who is military, and his parents are divorced. Can you be my mommy? He has asked her every day since halfway through last year. Apparently the divorce was messy and the kid's mom left and never came back. And she unloaded these on me, thinking I was in for some light-hearted pre-K kid stories. I'm instead was treated to this. My mom is very passionate about her job, thank God, and she does her best for these kids. Her first year, she managed to save a kid's finger after it was nearly ripped off, so I hope she works her magic on this group as well. I was the student in these cases, but I still felt like sharing. First class of the school year. Our philosophy teacher told us to write a little bit about the happiest moment in your holiday. He came to me after the class to tell me how brave it was that I did all of that. I wrote about binding for the first time, which was good. I told about hiding it from my transphobic family and everything. English class. We also got the same assignment in Dutch, so I did the same. Teacher told us to write something about a hobby. My only hobby is writing, so naturally, I loved it. I wrote about how writing is my escape from this cruel world, from self-harm, eating disorders, depression, etc. and my own mind. My teacher never got to read it, but I kept it to myself, which I think was the best. In Dutch class, I translated the entire essay and adjusted it a little. We had to switch it with the person next to you. Her essay was about music. I got mine back with a few tears on it. I have some other stories, but they aren't really important. I used to teach junior preschool and was a teaching assistant for a grade 1 teacher. There were one in each class that really got me. One was a little boy, about 3, who had a lot of big emotions. He was constantly having temper tantrums and was showing signs he was on the spectrum. So we followed our protocols, which involves talking to the parents. The father downright refused to listen and told us his child wasn't a retard and left. The boy constantly would follow other kids in the class that did him wrong and try to spank them while yelling, "This is what you get." We had to report it, and his grandma dropped him off for a bit. Eventually his parents separated and his mom got him the help he needed. The father was eventually not allowed to pick him up from school. It was a sad situation. A kiddo in my grade 1 class was Mormon and not allowed to participate in a lot of things because of that. One day she was laying in the hall drawing a picture and she was crying. I asked her what was up and sat down with her and listened to her tell me that she was sad she couldn't be in the classroom because we were having a birthday party for one of the other students. how she was mad her mom makes her be Mormon, and that she never gets presents or nice things because her mom tells her that God wanted it that way. It broke my heart because her mom insisted she wasn't allowed even in the classroom during any holiday or parties they didn't approve of. Secondary drama teacher here. This happened the other day with one of my SEN kids. He's autistic/ADHD. 12 years old. We were doing a super fun lesson on storytelling using freeze frames, and he was getting so frustrated over his story not being good enough. The jumper, sweater for my American friends, came off, shirt untucked, hair flustered, cheeks reddened, and I was trying really hard to just gently encourage him and lift his spirits up. He was having none of it. End of the lesson. He's still up on a 7/8 on the stress scale. I've worked with autistic kids for 5+ years, so at this point I'm just trying to keep him as chill as possible and be very soft with him. I passed him his jumper and shoes, and as he was getting dressed he muttered under his breath, "I'm so stupid. Why am I so stupid? I just want to fucking kill myself." He sounded so serious, it absolutely broke my heart. I pretended I didn't hear what he'd said, but I did follow up with "Are you feeling okay? You can talk to me if you're not." This poor little thing has the absolute lowest self-esteem of any kid I've ever worked with, and it's shattering watching him beat himself up so badly. Poor little baby. I wanted to just squeeze him better. Edit a word. A teacher of mine, when I was preparing to become a teacher, told me you will see everything humankind has to offer in 1 year, the best and the worst. He was right. I remember 4 things. Career day. 1 pupil, around 14, wrote nothing to answer "What do you want to do later?" I tried to make him find an answer, asking what interested him. Nothing. I kept going. "You'll need money to buy a car and a place to live. You have to work to get some." He told me he'd live on the street. After some more questions he finally told me he was good for nothing. I told him not to believe anyone who said that about him. It was his parents. For his whole life, he believed them. Same career day. 2 girls, 14, get pregnant ASAP, get money from the state, pay for an OSA job and a boob job. Thought they were joking. Nope, said a teacher. Life plan. 2 kids in detention. 1 boy I knew well, 1 girl I had seen before and seemed nice. The boy was usually a great funny bright kid, so I asked him why he was here. Told me he had slapped the girl. Surprised by his answer, I tried to explain to him that he should never hit a woman/girl or anybody. He agreed with me. The next day, I heard from another teacher why he had slapped her. During arts class, she had sprayed his pants with paint, then said, "Oh, I forgot your parents are too poor to pay you new ones." That little beach from hell. Sincerely hope he made well, and that she grew up. 1 colleague came one day during recess. I just learned that one of my pupils prostitutes herself to pay for her alcohol and drugs. She's 11. Isn't it a bit young? She was joking not to cry. I taught a youngster who was very angry all the time. The students were not allowed to wear jewelry. He was wearing a ring, so I asked him to remove it for me to put in the safe till the end of the day. I expected a blow up, but he explained that his dad was on drugs, sold everything he owned, and his granddad's ring was all he had left. He explained he was allowed to wear it in the day because at night he had a shower and something to eat at the school, and left his uniform and ring with a staff member so his dad couldn't sell them. He would return in the morning for breakfast, shower and put his uniform and ring back on. His mum loved him, but lived with this violent drug user who wanted to hit him if he saw him, so the boy would stay out on the streets until his mum waved to him from the window to say it was safe to come home. I saw the young man in a very different light after that, and ensured that I helped him as much as possible. I talked to him and smiled when I saw him. I told staff who complained about him the reason for his behavior. He started to behave better in many of his lessons because teachers were being nicer to him, and he left school with some qualifications. I don't know what happened to him after, but I think of him whenever I'm lamenting my life. Not me, but my mom. Back when she used to teach shanty camp children back in South Africa from 3rd 6th grade. Not a specific student, but a complication of things she's heard from her students the years. "Sorry if I'm dirty, miss. I couldn't find dry clothes today. It was raining that week." Turns out the kid lived in a tin hut with no furniture or even a floor in it, so he lived on the ground. Ground got soaked due to the rain. I don't want to go home. My uncle's visiting today. Student who stayed behind in her class long after the school day ended. Turns out her uncle's been sexually abusing her. She was in 3rd grade. No, we never get to eat on holidays. 4th grader. When my mom asked her if she was excited for the summer holidays. Sorry, ma'am, Neely couldn't come to school today. Her mom passed away. 5th grade. Kid's mom died from disease. Because they couldn't afford a proper doctor, mom took a survey in a class full of 6th graders, following the topic of HIV. Asked them how many of them had lost parents, friends, or family to HIV. Only 6 students in a class of 24 didn't raise their hand. Kid in 3rd grade got excited over a 10 rand note he found dropped on the ground. Why? I can finally help mama afford food. 10 rand is literally $0.66. Had her a whole bunch of girls stay behind in her class over the years. Generally out of fear. Reason why? They were afraid of their male family members due to molestation or sexual abuse. Now keep in mind, this has been going on since she started teaching 3rd grade. These girls were only 9 years old when they've been starting to do this. To make matters worse, when we went back to South Africa in 2012, she found out one of her students who was gang raped in 5th grade was killed by one of her rapists. She was 16 when she died and on her way to completing matric. My mom's been with her ever since she was in her 5th grade class, after she noticed her being more downcast and panicky than usual, and on her way into developing a eating disorder. She was the one who helped protect that girl and get her back on her feet, which pulled her through to matric in the first place. So for her, when she heard the news, she didn't take it well. She didn't take it well at all, because it was like losing her second daughter to her. My mom stopped teaching in SAP when I was a child though. Partly because due to the 2009 stock market crash, my dad lost his job, and since our household is one that requires 2 incomes to support it, we had to move overseas in the search of better jobs. Partly because she was getting depression from working in an environment where she has to hear all this depressing and messed up shit happening to children as young as freaking 9 years old. She never talked about it when I was younger, but recently over the years as I've asked her about it, she's been opening up and telling me about this kind of stuff more. Almost a decade later, since she's left that teaching job. Not a teacher, but I was in high school supervisor. One day a kid comes at me and tell me that a girl he knew was planning a suicide because her father was beating her. He made me promise to not talk about it. He was just seeking advice to help her out. I told him it was impossible, that I had to talk about it to someone, but that I will talk with her first. So did I. I did my best to comfort her, but I still had to talk about it to my superiors. She hated me for that, like really, but last time I heard about it, she was fine and alive. Her father was no longer in charge of her, and she went to university. There is also this girl who came to me and my colleague asking for advice to stop using drugs. She felt depressed and felt useless, and taking drugs was her only way out of thinking. But she really wanted to stop. We knew that she was smoking weed, but never knew about other stuff. We decided at first not to tell anyone, and just gave her a weekly appointment. She had to come and tell us about how things went, if she smoked, if she took something a bit stronger. We were not judging her, but we wanted her to get better and tell her parents herself. It was a lot of pressure for her, because her parents thought she was a perfect girl. They took it well and just told her that they were there for her and that she was loved. When she did, we asked her to tell to our superior. Superior helped her get a more professional help, but she kept coming every week to tell us how things were going. She was very grateful that we helped her, relief that her parents weren't hating her for that. She is now drug free and super happy. It makes me proud that I made a difference in someone's life. I wish I told the truth to my teachers and school psychologists for years what was happening. I had school psychologists checking on me from 5 years old to 18. However, my parents promised to make my life much more miserable than it was already, and to keep it in the family that these things were normal. I kept it to myself all through school. I was being thrown around, beaten and kicked out, just because my parents were angry at their jobs, or at each other. It finally all came out when I was 18, and it was the last week of school. My dad tried to run me down in his car and pull me in because he insisted I was late. He was going to take me home and beat the shit out of me. I ran into the office and hid under a desk and asked for them to hide me because my dad was going to beat me. I was 30 minutes early to school. I shown him my phone's time and he told me I was lying. The police came and the school advised I go somewhere safe and I had nowhere else to go. My mom came and she dumped me off at my boyfriend's apartment and said not to come home. The counselor and psychologist were so frustrated they couldn't do anything to help because I was 18. I've had a few incidents, but nothing comes even close to the comments I've seen here so far. I'm still attending university and want to become a teacher. I've completed my teacher training studies and worked as a substitute teacher for 6 weeks. One of the strongest people I met was a 16-year-old girl who struggled with depression and panic attacks. She couldn't live at home because of the severity of her condition, and she told me about a lot of things that had happened to her and her friends at the youth home she lived in. She had no friends in her class, and she was constantly being bullied by everyone in her class. And I mean everyone. There was one kid initiating it, and the rest went along with it. During the first lesson I had with this group, she didn't take out her books. She just sat at her desk, looking at her phone wearing headphones. I asked her if she had her books with her. She nodded, and I told her to take them out. She didn't. I knew immediately there was something going on with her, so I let her be. When we started working in pairs, I gently asked her if she wanted to participate. Again, she said nothing. Just shook her head. A few minutes later she got up and left the classroom. I continued on with the lesson as if nothing had happened and then asked a couple of her classmates if this was normal. They said she would leave the classroom at least once a day. During recess the girl came back, apologized for leaving, and straight up told me about everything that was going on with her and that she could feel a panic attack coming and had to leave to not trigger it. We talked for a while, and I convinced her it was fine for her to leave whenever she felt the need to, as long as she came up to tell me which hiding spot she would go to, so I'd know how to reach her in case of emergency. She made a habit of staying after class once a week, just to talk about random things, like her friends who had a puppy, her music hobbies, and her big sister who traveled the world. She even brought her viola with her, so she could play it for me. There wasn't one thing in particular she said that stayed with me, just the general feel of our interaction. She was so happy just to have someone who seemed to care about her. She asked about my tattoos and my scars, and I told her I might tell her about them one day. I also have a long history with mental illness, and this girl's experiences reminded me of myself when I was her age. She was smart and sweet, and her classmates hated her because they felt that she was given special privileges by the teachers. They asked to talk to me about it, clearly upset, and I told them that I couldn't speak for other teachers, but when I see a student who's struggling, I would rather give them the room and support they need than add to their problems by yelling or making them feel even worse. I really hope her classmates understood my reasoning and that she's doing well. I still think about her sometimes and hope that she will remain as strong as she was back then. Not as depressing as these other posts, but unique. I'm a high school teacher for students with severe autism, and our program has among the most extreme cases in my state. We are an ISD that takes in kids the local districts can't support due to the severity of their behaviors. I have a student who is extremely aggressive at school and at home, urinates and defecates in his pants regularly, despite being toilet trained since 4, and smears his feces. He's verbal, but mostly just repeats what others say to him. He has some mental illness concerns as well. His behavior is very up and down. Some weeks he will flip or throw tables and desks, hit staff and students, and tear down curtains, and try to hit his mom in the head with the rod. She had to lock herself in her room. His mom said she stopped buying him dresses because he usually breaks them within a week. Other weeks he's an angel and my favorite person in the world. This student also scripts or reciting a memorized sequence of words, things I'd assume he's hearing at home. Here are some of the things I've heard. Don't break your dresser. Don't break your dresser now his name. Don't do that. Don't fuck with me. What the fuck are you doing? Sit yours down and many others I can't think of at the moment. Him. and his parents live in a 2-bedroom apartment that he routinely destroys. He's put his head through drywall on more than one occasion. Mom has asked his doctor if there are any psych hospitals with open beds that he can stay at. My heart breaks for his parents because they've been given one of the hardest parenting jobs I could imagine, and the state is failing them by providing sheet services and no help. And they've resorted to being heavy-handed with him to stop the aggression. I think about him outside of work often, and I hope they can find the help they need. Not a teacher, but overheard from another student. I used to have a history teacher that I grew fairly close with. Not in a creepy way, just as a fatherly figure, in a way. My friend was even closer with him, and he even knew about her less than ideal life at home. The extent of his and my knowledge was that her parents often fought and threatened to kick her out, but that was all. One day, we hung around after class to chat with him, and the conversation turned to my friend telling us about her father physically abusing her. She showed us her bruises, and we found out that it had been going on for almost an entire year, and she hadn't told anyone. It got so bad that she ended up in the hospital just a few nights prior. When our teacher asked her why she had kept quiet about it for so long when she could have been killed, she shrugged and said, "I didn't think it would matter to anyone." She truly believed that if she had died at the hands of her father, no one would have cared. I knew she struggled with her self-worth and feeling loved, but I never realized it was so bad that she thought we would be indifferent if she died. That sheet broke my faking heart. I don't know if this counts, but one day in math we had to do an assignment which we had to send by email each day after we worked on it. In the subject line I accidentally wrote "my suicide me" and friends were talking about Suicide Squad, and out of habit of listening to their conversation, I accidentally substituted my graph with "my suicide." The next day, when I arrived at school, my teacher saw me in the hallway and said, "Hey, what was that?" Me, being confused as to what she was talking about, questioned her. She replied, "The email?" Me, huh. It was captioned with "my suicide." Was it a joke? Did a student type it in for you when you weren't looking? Me, still being utterly confused and hating the feeling of being in trouble, just agreed and said, "Oh, probably." But as I look back at it now, it made me realize she didn't do anything to check up on me just in case I was actually feeling such thoughts. There was no call to me or my parents' numbers, which the school would obviously have. There was no actions taken to ensure I was alright, etc. And it made me realize not everyone cares enough to do something, and it's sad to think if someone really had such an intention that you wouldn't automatically reach out just to be sure. Because you never know if that one phone call could be the little pull they needed to know their lives were worth living and to carry on. I'm not a teacher. I'm a lead camp monitor for summer camps that kids and teens can go to. Last summer we were driving back from Spain through France and had to stop at a car accident that looked very much like someone had tried to kill themselves. The front row had, well, front row seats to everything. These kids were 13 or 14 years old, so they know what death is, and they at least heard of suicide. We had to stop for a good half hour to be let through, and all the while we are sitting in near full view of the scene. A very battered car, blood on the road for a foot, 20 meters like skid marks, and at the end a body under a white piece of fabric behind a fire engine. I spent the night mostly talking to the kids in the front about what had happened and answering their questions. One of them hit home. She went quiet, tears in her eyes with a sort of terrified stare in front of her, worse than any of the other kids. I tried talking to her twice, but she didn't want to. I tried a third time by sitting next to her for a while quietly, and then I asked her about what she thought had happened in the accident. And she finally opened up. She thought it looked like a suicide, same as I thought, and still think to this day. She asked me why someone would possibly go to that point to end their life, and I explained. Depression, suicidal thoughts, self-harm. And then she told me she was worried about her best friend. The best friend suffered from depression, and she had been talking to her and made the girl worried, very worried. She was terrified she couldn't help her friend, terrified that she'd lose someone she loves so much. She didn't want to talk much about it anymore for a while, so I told her about my best friend's experiences and about those of my ex and my experiences with trying to help. that managed to get through to her, made her realize that I was in the same boat as her, and it made her open up even more, and we talked for quite a while longer about her feelings and worries around her best friend. I asked her if she had anyone to talk to about this stuff outside of the summer camp, but she didn't. She didn't want to talk to her parents about it, and I doubt many of her friends wanted to hear about it. After the talk, and after she'd calmed down, she wanted to try to sleep, since it was about 1 AM at this point. She gave me a hug and afterwards she went to sleep as I sat next to her for a while longer. It breaks my heart to see a girl that is normally quite happy and carefree has to have friends that have to struggle with these issues. It breaks my heart that a 13-year-old has to worry about her friends killing themselves, or that a 13-year-old would be thinking about it. I like to think I helped her, but the fact that her friend has to deal with depression is depressing. My grandmother taught special ed in our hometown, a very poor rural area, for 45 years. Back when she started teaching, she said that despite having an advanced degree specifically in special education, most kids were actually discipline cases, no problems outside of the fact that their home lives were so bad in their behavior in turn that they couldn't be around other kids. I think the saddest, and there were many stories, was Jimmy. Jimmy was very small for a 10-year-old and was always tired, but he was apparently very sweet. One day he asked to lay his head down, and my grandmother saw something smooth and round pop up around his shoulder, very obviously a tumor, by her description about the size of a golf ball. She told Jimmy he needed to tell his parents to take him to the doctor. They did. About 3 months later, the last time my grandmother saw Jimmy, she was walking into the post office and he excitedly yelled for her missus. She walked over the car he was in to find him bald and even smaller. They chatted for a bit. When he let her know, guess what, missus? I get to go to Disney World. She said she had to walk away because she burst out sobbing. I think I must have thrown some teacher for a loop. When I was in 6th grade, we had to do a report on different cultures, and being inventive, I thought I'd do it on need culture. My teacher thought it was fine, and TBH probably didn't care what I did, and so I dove into it with enthusiasm, because I was a nerd, and I knew all about it. My report was a pitch black view of loneliness and bullying sprinkled with basically the entire lyrics to White and Nerdy. I wrote very frankly and dispassionately that nerds don't have many friends, often are unattractive, ridiculed, and will remain at the bottom of social standing until the end of time. I also wrote about nerds' love of tea, Monty Python quotes, programming languages, and Wikipedia points. So when my pretty young cheerful teacher pulled me aside and asked, "Is this really what nerds are like?" I imagine it was the first glimpse into that world she had ever gotten. Unfortunately, I didn't pick up on the fact she was talking about the social hardships. I thought those were a fact of life and everyone knew that. I thought she was talking about how all nerds love tea. So I responded with a confused face and yeah, we like tea. It's not that strange. Before I wandered off. She never brought it up again, but looking back on it, I think she probably viewed me in a different light after that day. I used to work as a Head Start preschool teacher. We were having a getting ready for school type event with families and students, and I was off meeting and playing with the kids who were going to be in my class. I had pulled out a wooden puzzle that was a picture of all the prominent jobs in a town, like doctors or firefighters. One little kid, who was Hispanic, pointed to the picture of a policeman in the puzzle and said, "Is he going to come and take my mom away?" I was so caught off guard that I don't think I had any coherent response to their question. The way they said it just shattered my heart. They seemed truly upset, and that's not something any 4-year-old should have to worry about. And to give context, a majority of my students were from families who had recently immigrated to the US, some of whom did so probably not legally. This happened about 2 years ago, when ICE deportation started to pick up, at least in our local area. I went home that evening realizing that there was a legitimate possibility that some of my students might end up as a part of that, and as a relatively new/young teacher it was very heavy to think about. Not a teacher but the student. I actually have 2 things that come to mind. I suffer from pretty severe depression and went through some pretty hard stuff growing up. As a result, I went through a decade or so where I self-harmed. Usually I wore jackets or long sleeves to keep my arms hidden, so it wasn't an issue. However, I was in a home ec class, and one day we were supposed to be baking some cookies. For sanitary reasons, I had to push up my sleeves and my teacher saw my arm. I cried and begged her not to call my mom, and told her it would just get worse. It honestly would have, as my mom and I butted heads a lot over my mental health, and she had been contacted by the school when I was in middle school about my self-harm once already. The look on that teacher's face when I was literally begging her not to call home might have been the most pity I have ever seen. In the end, she didn't call home, but CPS got involved and threatened to remove me from the home if my mom didn't take me to regular therapy, so it did end up helping. The second one that comes to mind was from the following year. I was in graphic design class and the teacher decided he wanted us to be able to put meaning behind an image, so he put up a projection of a picture of this old decrepit building with all these cracks in it. He told us to write a short story about the image, and afterwards called on a few students to read their stories out loud. I poured my soul into my story. It was about a guy who found the building and connected with it on an emotional level. Each crack in the building represented a traumatic event in his life, Akashiti, traumatic things I had gone through, which all culminated in watching as the light left his dad's eyes. The story ended on a slightly upbeat note, with the guy trying to repair the building, as a metaphor for trying to repair himself. It was dead silent for a moment afterwards, until the teacher cleared his throat awkwardly and asked who wanted to try to follow that. Afterwards he kept trying to talk to me and I guess make sure I was okay, but I wasn't in the mental state to accept his help. It does mean a lot to me, though. The police wouldn't let us get into our house last night, so I couldn't get my backpack and homework. A mentally ill neighbor a few houses down had shot and killed his mother in an argument, then gone outside, entered through his next door neighbor's bedroom window, and there shot and killed the mother and 4-year-old little girl. He riddled the 16-year-old boy, a former student of mine, with bullets such that he was on life support for months. His 12-year-old sister he was protecting was only grazed. The father, hearing the original gunshots, had gone to the front door to protect his family, sending them to the bedroom to hide. He did not, and could not have thought the offender would break in through a side window. The shooter then casually walked into the middle of the street, dropped the gun, and waited for police to arrive and arrest him. He's now serving multiple life sentences. Police blocked off a large portion of the neighborhood, so my student couldn't get in her house. When I collected homework, she explained why she didn't have it. I brushed her concern away and said I didn't expect her to have it. The whole situation just still breaks my heart. She and a few other impacted students spent a good amount of time with the counselor that day. Oh man, so many. These are all 13 to 15-year-olds by the way. We have one kid who's severely depressed and often talks about how he doesn't think any of his work matters because his teachers have given up on him and he'll just end up homeless and dying on the streets anyway. There's a few kids who break my heart every time they mention being scared of confronting their parents or wanting to live with dad instead of mum because she yells a lot, etc. There's a couple of them who think no one will care about them unless they're interesting and are constantly creating drama or acting out, and it's obvious they're doing it so someone will pay attention to or fuss over them. They genuinely don't believe that anyone would care about them if they weren't involved in some drama or are so deprived of care and comfort at home that they need to create situations where they can get it at school. One of my absolute favorite kids is such a genuinely good kid, but has had such a shit hand from life. We work very closely with him, and whenever he does something dumb and gets himself in trouble he's so worried that we are going to think badly of him because that's the default he's had for so long. Kid's 14 and has been on and off addicted to various drugs for years. He's so clearly trying so hard, but keeps getting dragged into more shit. There was one kid who told me that he had an argument with his younger sister and tried to strangle her. He was clearly ashamed of it and is working through his anger issues, but damn, that one was a lot to process. There's another guy who reminds me so much of myself as a kid who's really loud and boisterous and tries really hard not to do any work because he's terrified of not understanding it. He's always making dumb jokes and tries so hard to get everyone to like him. He's very clearly overcompensating and acting super happy to hide how miserable he is. And it's heartbreaking. There's another kid whose older brother got expelled and jailed for drugs and beating the crap out of another kid. Everyone expects this kid to follow in his footsteps, and he knows it. It's so disheartening to see him accept his role so quietly. So many kids who are so scared of failure they regularly have breakdowns in class about it. So many kids whose parents don't care enough to make sure they're sleeping and constantly come in sleep deprived. There's so many shitty parents in the world, it's faked. I work in education support and we work with kids who often have difficult backgrounds and or learning disorders, so this isn't really representative of most classes anyway. I'm sad now, I'm gonna go hug my dog. Not my story, but I'm studying education. One of my professors told us this heart-wrenching story. During college, she worked at a stay-away science camp that was hosted at university on the East Coast. One of their camps was held each summer for at-risk students whose schools and communities fundraise/provide scholarships for these kids to go. My professor wanted to engage these students in the natural world in a different way, so one day they took her class outside and had them stand with a tree. They would then tell the narrative of the tree in a poem or story, just to feel a connection to nature. There was one little boy who appeared to be nonverbal for the first couple days of camp. He would complete his activities, but never seemed engaged and never interacted. When he took part in the tree activity, my professor found him with tears running down his face. She asked him what the tree was telling him, and he said the tree is alone. The tree is very sad, because everyone who loved him is gone. It turns out this boy hadn't been talking for a year, ever since his mom, dad, and siblings were shot in a drive-by shooting right in front of him. His counselor thought the camp might help him open up, or at the very least give him a change of scenery. I think about this story from time to time, and it was one of the main reasons I'm deciding to stay on the path of teaching inner city students. Back on my first prac, I had a kid that would wait for me by the gate before school. It didn't click at first, but after about a week I began to suspect this kid was deliberately waiting to meet up with me. She was a small kid, didn't appear to have too many friends, and would probably watch me get off the train that we caught. I didn't teach this student or share any classes with them, and it was well known by the stage across the school that I was a young preservist teacher. This kid was one of two students I learned loved hang around teachers for various reasons: lack of social skills, safety, etc. One day towards the end of my prac, the kid decides to mention that she's moving school to live with her dad and isn't looking forward to it. Looking to find a positive spin, I asked why. The response was, "My dad scares me, and not in a good way." A loaded sentence, especially coming from a 12-year-old, so I asked why that was the case. The kid proceeds to tell me that her entire family are physically and emotionally abusive towards her, and in detail. It was heartbreaking to hear this kid be so horribly treated by every adult in her home life. I reported it to the school, which I had to get it done on my behalf by another staff member, since I was not registered in the official education systems. It came out the school was aware of it via about 3 separate reports previous to mine, and the abuse was worsening because a sibling was expelled for damaging school property the year before, and that sibling had no one regulating his behavior at home. The school were doing the best they could. A lot of it came from the doc's lack of initiative. The whole situation led to a lengthy cry session as soon as I got home that night. I don't know whatever became of the student, and I'll never know. I can only hope the kid has been put in a better home, and I do hope this is the case. There are a lot of students with only the teacher as a stable person in their lives, and sometimes you won't see it until they decide to tell you. I work in a school for students who need some extra support. We work with the lower 10% in the county. Very high poverty, lots of kids on probation, lots of kids in the foster system, and lots of mental health issues. I have a student whose mother killed herself and blamed it on the student when she was 14. She is older now and still suffers greatly. I had an East student who was raped by her cousin. Didn't find that part out until well after she was gone, had a baby, then got arrested for child neglect because the poor girl didn't know basic skills to take care of herself, let alone a baby. I've had a student who was cheery and wonderful. One day he was sad and didn't want to chat. The next day he shot himself in the head. I had a student whose parent does heavy drugs. Her brother shot himself accidentally while on drugs. Her nephew died in a pool that she found. When the boy was 2, the girl got pregnant, and in the second trimester her boyfriend kicked her in her stomach because she wouldn't give him the money she had for rent, and she lost the baby. I regularly call CPS, and our school therapist is one of the best around. We have a ton of programs for our students, including a food program, free thrift shops, and group counseling. It's a much harder field than I ever expected. No one teaches you in school how to deal with these things and also teach a subject to them. Okay, this is different, but I'm a student, and I had to write an essay between 400 to 800 words, and the topic was the day where I find myself, which is like where you find what type of person you are and such. And I was like, that's faking stupid, and I'm not gonna waste my goddamn time on a faking 800 essay. So I wrote the essay with 400 words using music lyrics just to make it longer. Also, I did change the lyrics so that it was referring to me. Example, he to I, etc. I used depressing phrases like look at me now, a fool with everything, but yet I'm still so hollow. Look at me now, no lights, just struggling to find my way back home. Which is from Motionless in White. And now what have I become? I once felt like home. Now a ghost in the fog with my love is just a frail disguise to hide the pain behind my eyes. Also from Motionless in White. And then nothing left, now I'm feeling numb, and just like you, I couldn't love someone. And nothing in the cage of my ribcage. Got no heart to break, I like it that way. Nothing in the cage of my ribcage. Emptiness is safe, keep it that way. And used to be, I had light. I had fire in my chest. But now I'm all out. And I've got nothing left, which is from Andy Black. It all sounds plagiarized, but English is my second language, and I had to write it in Afrikaans, which was no deal. Though I wonder what was the moderator's reaction reading that. I'm not a teacher, but it was my teacher. Reading all these comments made me remember back when I was in 6th grade. I got bullied a lot by basically everyone besides the few friends I had. My dad was a drug addict and would spend all of our money on drugs, while my mom tried her best to cope with everything. I was her shoulder to cry on. Anyway, I started to self-harm. One teacher noticed it and told my school counselor. I ended up getting into therapy, where the therapist would come to my house once a week. I was still self-harming. My teacher would talk to me every day to try and cheer me up. He actually started to check my arms to make sure no new cuts were there. Then one day, while I was wearing capris, he realized I was now cutting the back of my legs. He told the counselor again, and she said, if I came to school again with new cuts, CPS would need to get involved. My parents said I needed to quit or else my brother and sister would get taken away. He honestly made school easier to cope with. He was always nice and tried helping me out. I was a substitute teacher at a school for a few weeks that was notorious for bad behavior. All the kids would chat and take turns acting out, and it was a handful to deal with, but by the end of my time there I actually felt like I'd gotten some amount of control over my classroom. One of the kids in my class acted out and did the most ridiculous things, from standing on hairs and tables, to yell at other students in other classes, to dry humping instruments in the music room. I sat him down after one lesson and asked why he felt the need to do such things and ruin the class for the students who were enjoying it. He confided in me that his regular teacher had apparently had a breakdown one lesson due to the kids misbehaving, and told him that he should just drop out as he'll never achieve anything in this class. He told me that, even though he'd say some dumb things, he was enjoying the lessons and was really hurt by what the teacher had said, so decided he'd just act out and be stupid during class time, as he genuinely believed that he'd never be good enough after the teacher had said that to him. Really opened my eyes to how impressionable kids can be, and that he was acting out because he was upset and nobody had ever bothered to sit him down and talk to him. All the staff had just pointed him out as the terrible kid to not bother with. I'm an English teacher abroad. I came here to Taiwan with the intent to do this for a while as a profession, and 10 years out, it's going pretty well. I'm incredibly thankful that I don't have any horror stories about the kids I've taught, but some of my adult students have opened up about some pretty weird stuff. The worst was when a whole discussion class of adults matter-of-factly informed me that the prior teacher had taught them about how the Holocaust was fake, and Western countries blow it way out of proportion. The guy wasn't a regular there, but a sub, and they told me he said he learned this in school in South Africa. Apparently, he left out that fact, that he went to Nazi school, where he was a faking full-on Nazi. We were reading about the anniversary of the Diary of Anne Frank, maybe, when one of them stood up and started in, and I told him very sternly that back home, that joke was rather distasteful. When others got confused and explained the situation, I just said, "Are you faking kidding me?" and had to excuse myself for a good 10 minutes. I came back and had to do a little history lesson for the remainder, then told the staff never to hire that guy again. I know I'm late, but in June of last school year I experienced the most depressing thing I've ever experienced as a teacher. I was teaching grade 4 in a vulnerable school. I dealt with behaviors and crazy family stories on the daily, but the one that sticks out the most to me is one girl who for most of the school year was a star student. Then one day, like a switch was flicked, she became my biggest behavior problem in my class. She became extremely defiant, began mocking me when I would ask her any questions about why she changed so suddenly, and was being sent home and suspended regularly for being completely disrespectful to myself, our admin, and her classmates. We also saw her trying to self-harm in the classroom a couple times. Mental health was contacted several times on behalf of her also. We really put all of our resources into helping her for the last month of school and just couldn't seem to get through. Then on the third last day of school she was pulled from the gym into the vice principal's office because all she was doing in the gym was banging her head super hard on the wall. I went into the VP's office with her, sat on the floor and just asked her in a super calm voice, what were you hoping would happen from banging your head on the wall? She laughed and said that was fun. The VP was getting visually upset at that answer and started to raise his voice, but I interjected calmly again and said, what were you hoping would happen? She then started to cry and dipped her head very low. I asked her for about the millionth time what she has been thinking about lately, because we saw such a drastic change in her for the last month. She wouldn't answer me, so I asked her if she would write it for me. She nodded, so I got her a pencil and paper and the VP, and I left the room for her to write. When I saw she was done writing, I went back in and read what she wrote. It was one sentence: my friend, name, was being bullied at her school and she hung herself. I obviously was taken aback and asked her where her friend went to school. She told me in the community where her dad lives. I asked how old her friend was, thinking maybe she was a bit older than my student. Nope, she was also in grade 4. I then asked when this happened. She would answer. I asked if it was recently. She nodded. I asked if it was like a month ago. She nodded again. I then had to have a very compassionate conversation about suicide, which as a grade 4 teacher I was not expecting to do. I set her up with our school social worker, who then set her up with grief counseling through the summer. Now I see her in the hallways and she's smiling and looks so grateful to be at school each day. I also am getting so many hugs and drawings from her, even though I'm not a homeroom teacher this year. That girl will always be in my heart. I'm not a teacher, but I was 15 and doing work experience as a classroom assistant at my old primary. I live in a small village, so everyone there knows everyone mostly, and there was this one kid who nobody liked. He could. My mother is a teacher. She's free in the weekends and has a small child, her student from maybe in 1st or 2nd grade. Come over, she takes care of him, makes him do his homework and all, because both his parents are busy with work even on weekends. During weekdays he stays in his mother's dorm, but she goes out in weekends and has nobody to take care of him. Once my mother asked him if he likes staying with us. She was cooking lunch and he was watching her eagerly. He's very shy and usually doesn't speak. She wasn't even expecting him to answer, but he surprised her by saying yes. She then asked him what he likes about us the most. It's a simple question, and he takes a while to respond. Finally, when he speaks, he begins by saying, "You don't beat me." My mother obviously confronts his mother about this. They're both in the living room away from the child as she asks. His mother has a neutral face, almost as if she's heard this too many times. She says she's never laid a hand on him, and mother then asks if there's anyone else in their family who might. His mother says she has a sister, and before making his son stay at our place, she tried getting him settled with his aunt. She said she has, my mother quotes, bad relationship with each other, so they had to send him at our. When we ask her if her sister might have been abusive, she very calmly denies everything, saying my sister would never hurt anyone, let alone a child. She simply isn't that type of a person. The conversation ends. The child leaves at the end of the weekend, and that's the last we've heard from him. His mother won't bring him back. Wherever he is, I hope he's safe, and we are very sorry we couldn't do anything to help him before we were too late. I got a couple stories. I'm not a teacher but mommies. Story 1. I go to a kinda rough school, not exactly in the best area. Not that there are good areas in Birmingham. There is this person who is very much an outcast and is bullied by the whole year. My friends are a few people who speak to her. After seeing her, they tell me about her list. She writes down the names of everyone she wants to kill. I don't know who is on the list, but it certainly exists. I feel so bad, but lack the social skills to talk to her. Story 2. My mom has taught in year 2 for probably the last 3 to 4 years. Yet again, not the best areas. She comes home with various stories. Some good, some bad. This one I can't forget. Mom has Senko training for higher understanding of SEN kids. This kid was autistic with a few other hindrances I can't remember. He would get angry, scream, cry, throw tables/chairs. These kids are 6 to 7. Anyway, they keep files and checks on kids. This kid asks my mom not to tell his mom that he was misbehaving, or she would go. She was threatening to leave her autistic son. This got him very depressed. Sadly, it doesn't end. The kid's mom promised him a house with a garden, probably lived in flats. He never got it. Point, it's a sad world we live in. I would share more, but it's too depressing here. Had a rail thin diabetic student whose blood sugar ran consistently extremely high, 300 to 500. Parents wouldn't take him to the hospital when it got that high, wouldn't provide school with his supplies for his diabetes, and let him eat anything he wanted. Oh, and the dad beat the hell out of him one night. Kid came to school with bruises all over him. He was removed from the home and is with a foster family now. Since then, his blood sugar is almost entirely under control. Puberty is a beach 41D, and he looks like a totally different kid. Another kid came to me with several warnings that she'd attacked and tried to stab teachers, would self-harm, etc. She had a lot of major mental disorders that caused her to be defiant and extremely reactive when you tried to correct the behavior. We got somewhat close, and she told me about her young childhood. Addicted to cocaine and heroin by age 10. Watched her mom's boyfriend repeatedly kick pregnant mom in the stomach because mom was pregnant and didn't want the baby. When talking to a friend in law enforcement about it, friend told me the drug use that early was a sign her mother was prostituting the child to people. Point, a kid my first year was from a large family that had basically no money. He was abnormally small for his age due to malnourishment, but he was expected to help his dad break down trailers and stuff to sell scrap. He and his clothes were always dirty. We were all almost certain, but couldn't prove, the dad was molesting the 2 older sisters, later confirmed by the oldest. On a good day, the kid was mostly attentive and a B student. On a bad day, I couldn't get him to sit down to do his work. One day, he came in completely shut down and would lash out at anyone who spoke to him. I finally got him to talk to me, and his father had told him the previous night that he didn't give a shit about him and he could go die in a hole for all he cared. This kid idolized his dad, so it completely destroyed him mentally. The school repeatedly tried to get CPS involved, but they never would do anything. Okay, here I thought the comments would be about kids dabbing or saying cringy shit. But just while I was crying halfway through reading the first few top replies, I was a teacher for a little bit. Not currently, but I do have my papers. And I remember during my studies we had to do practical teaching as a TAR at different schools. This isn't so much as a kid saying anything, but about hearing about some of the kids at this special school I did my practical at once. One kid's parents were working hard to try and keep him. They were car guards and basically homeless to my understanding. They just couldn't get on top, no matter how hard they worked. The kid lashed out a lot at school and got sent to this special school, where he also slept over it in the hostels. He still lashed out a lot, and that's how I found out of his story. He was causing me trouble, and one of the other teachers told me his situation. And it just saddened me, since he was maybe grade 1 or 2, so still so young. Another kid at the school in the class has autism, but he wasn't very functional on his own, so they were going to send him to the more practical stream at the school rather than academic. He had very bad social skills, and was also getting bigger, so they were worried he could hurt the other kids and such. Anyway, when I just started there for my training period, he refused to interact with me, listen to me or anything. But by the end, he actually gave me a hug when I was finishing up my last day there. The teacher told me afterwards that I was the first of the trainee teachers he hugged or showed any sort of emotion to. Point on the flip side, I was at a regular high achieving school one year and was doing recess duty at kindergarten when one of the kids sang, very loudly and happily, a song by the girl from Diane Ward. It was before all these allegations and bad press, but I just remembered the cold shudder and feeling of hearing a little girl sing that kind of garbage. Not a teacher, but once broke down in tears and ended up spilling my guts about how my parents were always yelling and fighting, and that I hate the police's visits. They always make daddy leave. In the end, I'm glad they sometimes took him away, just mad they let someone who repeatedly mentally and physically abused his children and wife come within a mile of my siblings. I was only 9, making my brother 5 years old. We usually keep my brother from the arguments, so he thinks my mom starts them for no reason, even though it's because he's being abusive or talking down on my siblings. Another thing, he tried to send my sister to jail for coming at him with a knife, which didn't happen. He was worried she would speak out on the abuse, which she did. He probably would have won if my mom didn't speak up on it. He still got to come home every day. So, second instance, this time with several witnesses including me, a month probation. A 9-year-old can't handle having police constantly at her door. I broke down, and my teacher was fairly surprised, cause I was usually am pretty energetic. Many people mix between solitude and loneliness. The first one is a state of detachment of the existence of other beings, in which you don't feel like you miss them, nor they are relevant in any way, 100% self-sufficient. Point the second is when you being like water deprived, but instead of water it's people. That can be either someone special or the urge to have a social life. Or dear ones. Usually, these two have great impact on the psyche of humans, as we tend to lose the sense of what's right or wrong. Closed in your world, where you make the rules and destroy them. Small world. Point usually, you are between a very thin line of madness, greatness, and disturbance. Point check the book of Carl Jung. Point personal experience as the number 2 of a major company. I stop to wonder every now and then about what's missing in my life. For those interested, I happen to land on an article, a helpful chart that shows depression in college, which I remember reading about it in my early times along the way. Point for those interested in the source. Point thanks for posting.